One. Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Thank you all for being here this morning. My name is Vanessa Lopez with Project Muse out of Imperial County, SELPA. Our project is improving outcomes for multilingual students with exceptional needs. And today we're looking at supporting multidisciplinary teams serving dually identified students, taking a step back today and starting with a systems improvement approach to pre-referral. This is day one of a two-part series. Thank you for being here. We recognize that for our Zoom friends joining us online, sitting through an entire day of online learning can be difficult. So what we do to support your learner needs is we start with scheduled breaks readily available to you up front so you can start planning your day and take your breaks accordingly, of course, knowing that we are all adults with adult needs. If you need to step away from the screen, know that it is okay because we will be following up with a recorded link to today's content via OMS sometime next week once we've edited for sound quality and video quality as well. So we're starting right now at 8:30, a little bit behind schedule, but you know, we're here, we're doing this. We have a 9:30 break, one again at 10:30, and then we are going to try to break for lunch at 11:30, though we ask for some grace in that we might have to push it back to either 11:40, 11:45, so that it's a natural, clean break, but count on that lunch taking place anywhere between 11:30 and 11:40, just to give yourself some cushion. You will get a full hour lunch, so we will be starting back here until 12:30. Once we're here at 12:30, we're going to work through to 1:30, take a break, and if necessary, we might take another break at 2:30, or we can just push through all the way to the end so we can be done by 3 p.m. So again, hopefully this is helpful to you so that you can plan your learning day, whether you're joining us here in person with our in-person friends or joining us via Zoom. We also want you to know that we value your participation and that this is a webinar forum. So because this is a webinar forum, we have a couple of ways that we want you to participate with us. If you're in person, of course, raise your hand, call us over. We'll be happy to go over to you. If you are joining us on Zoom, know that you can use the chat feature to share any responses that the presenters, me, myself, or Jessica, who will be joining us in a little bit, ask for you to participate in. Use the chat feature for that. Use it to communicate your insights, share information, and or reflections via the chat. We also have the Q&A enabled, and I want you to use this feature to submit your questions to the presenters. So make sure that you type it there. If you have a question, don't type it in the chat because we'll lose your question, and we want to honor all of your questions. And by using the Q&A feature, you hold us accountable to address your questions and to remind us also during the breaks to go back into that Q&A to look at any common themes so that we may cover or emphasize some topics that have come up consistently. So today's resources are all linked within the slide deck. So you can access today's resources simply by scanning the QR code on your screen or by typing in the bit.ly link to your browser to be able to access today's slide deck. If for some reason or another that link is broken, which we know happens, would it even be a Zoom if we don't have technology issues, please let us know using the chat feature online, or if you're here in person, just by raising your hand, and we'll be sure to double check that that link is active and accessible to you. You will be prompted to create a copy, and we do that to honor your learner needs because I know that after a day of dense information, no matter how entertaining we try to make it for you and engaging, sometimes we need to reflect back to the content. So please let us know if that is not working. Okay, so Jessica, could you help me with that? Perfect. So we have Jessica in the behind the scenes giving you access because I did warn you, would it even be a Zoom without technical difficulties? So we'll take care of that for you briefly. However, I do want to tell you that all of the resources that are linked there are free for you to use however you see fit or necessary. If you like some of the information on the slide decks, you can take those slides and use them. You can also make them your own. Any of the resources that are linked there are free and available for you to also download, access, and share out. If you make one of the resources better, please share back with us. We love getting to know what is helpful for others in the field. And I always love seeing the level of expertise and thoughtfulness into how some of these resources that we put out for the field end up being 100 times better and more useful to all of you. So if you are still checking to see if you have access, is it working now? Perfect. Jessica, thank you so much. It looks like it is. All right, so I've been talking for a while and I haven't formally introduced myself to you. Those of you that have been joining our Muse sessions over the years are familiar with some of the faces you see on the screen. My name is Vanessa Lopez. I am a project coordinator for Project Muse and also a coordinator here at Imperial County SELPA. My areas of focus are English learners with disabilities. It is also assistive technology. I am an assistive technology assessor, and I'm also an education, physical education, adaptive physical education specialist. And on my Saturdays, I am an adjunct professor at Azusa Pacific University. So yeah, busy, busy, busy. But what keeps me the busiest, what keeps my heart full the most is something that I share often with you joining us in the Zoom and here in person, is that I am mother to two fantastic children. But it is my 14-year-old that gets a lot of my attention because, as I've shared often, he is on the autism spectrum, primary disability, secondary disability, OHI for ADHD combined type. And I always joke that if there were a third line on SACE, it would be generalized anxiety disorder because he does have that diagnosis well. So that makes for a fun and engaging evening at the Lopez Mendoza residence. So I am here joining you all today, bringing those multiple lenses to the work that we do. We also have Cristina Zavala, our SELPA Senior Director, as part of our team, Lupita Holguin Rubio, who brings the ELD general education lens to our project. We have Dr. Deborah Montoya as our executive consultant, who used to be our SELPA Senior Director, is now Special Education Director at Oceanside Unified District. And Jessica Crothers Rajiotis joining us in the back. Jessica, do you want to tell a little bit about yourself and the lens you bring to the work?
Sure, give me 1 second. Alrighty, well, my name is Jessica Crothers Rajiotis. I am new to the Imperial County SELPA team. Well, not new, I keep saying that, but I guess it's been since July. So I'm currently a coordinator working with English learners with disabilities within the Project Muse, but my background is working with students with extensive support needs. So as a classroom teacher, as a coordinator within a special education program within the county. So a little bit about me, but we'll go ahead and keep going.
Jessica is like way too, not even giving her the props that she deserves. She has so much experience working with our students with extensive support needs. And we recognized early on in the process that that was one of the lenses that was missing from our work, because typically a lot of the work and support that we provide, and especially the way individuals reach out for some support from us, it's typically from that mild to moderate support needs. But oftentimes when we had those requests for supporting students who were dually identified but had more extensive support needs, we were missing that lens. So we're incredibly grateful to have Jessica join our team. And the reason we point out our experience and our background is because we like to highlight the fact that this is not work that can be done by just one individual. You need a group of individuals with different lenses so that we can truly take a look at the whole child perspective and be able to address a lot of those areas of need. And as the topic for today indicates, this is all about that pre-referral and that pre-referral process before we get to identifying students as potential students with a need for special education services due to meeting eligibility criteria, one of the 13 distinct disability criteria. So Project Muse, Improving Outcomes for Multilingual Students with Exceptional Needs, is part of the California statewide system of support, and this is in partnership with CCEE. And again, being funded by the CDE and CCEE is one of the greatest honors that we've had as Project Muse and in pushing the work out, because we are able to fully connect with other state agencies and projects that are available for all practitioners across the state, from our geographic leads to our superintendent schools to the resource leads initiatives. and additional projects within the state of California, each with their own area of expertise. We are charged to be facilitators, connectors, and capacity builders, and in partnership with the California Department of Education and the CCEE, through the work of the Special Education Resource Leads, we try to make an impact in the statewide system of support to improve outcomes for all students with disabilities. So Project Muse, much in line with the tiers of support, have developed resources and tools for educators, for practitioners, for LEAs, COEs, and SELPAs across the state that fall from level 1 universal supports, which are readily available for any practitioner across the state, to level 2 differentiated supports, which is more customized to meet individual needs or group needs, and then that tier 3 support, which is more around technical supports, specifically looking at data points, building multidisciplinary teams, looking at historical alignment of data and data analysis, as well as crafting, coaching, and supporting teams related to the braiding of the DA and the SIM process. Because our project has many resources, and that is not a humble brag, it is fact, we wanted to provide you with a quick one-pager, just if you want to take a look at some of the resources that we have available for you to explore, and that is linked here in the one-pager about our project. If you have some time later on today, have some quiet time, that one thing that none of us have too much of, take a look at this one-pager to learn more about the supports that our project brings to practitioners. That being said, introduce myself, introduce the project. Now I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself. The folks that are here in the room, while we're having our Zoom folks join the chat and let us know who they are, what their current role is, and where they're joining us from. We'll do a quick whip around here in the room while our Zoom friends let us know who is online. Zoom friends, hit the chat. So Zoom friends, our friends here joining us in person, we have a vast array of roles here, from meal coordinator, migrant coordinator, academic coaches, special education coaches, MTSS coordinators, lots of different roles here locally. And I'm wondering, Jessica, if you could share with me just briefly who's joining us online.
Yes, definitely. So we have a nice big mix. We have SELPA representation, special education teachers, speech and language pathologists, principals, assistant principals, a little bit of everything, which is nice to see. EL specialist. Awesome.
Wow, so we have a statewide multidisciplinary team joining. That is outstanding, just the kind of thing I love to see. So because we're bringing all these multiple lenses that have depth of expertise and experience, we want to start off by calling out what our session outcomes for today are. So today we are going to learn how to use a resource guide to support your own multidisciplinary team in identifying root causes and analyzing systems for English learners, again, through the lens of the pre-referral process. We are going to look at some strategies for enhancing and improving outcomes for students who are English learners, who are potentially in the mix for being identified as needing special education supports, but utilizing data-driven decision-making and targeted interventions. And I think that's one of the points that oftentimes gets missed when we are addressing issues related to over-identification of particular student groups. So we're going to delve deep into that conversation today. Also, I would be remiss if I did not mention the importance of the California English Learner Roadmap. The California English Learner Roadmap calls out 4 principles specifically. Principle 1, assessing the assets-oriented and needs-responsive schools. Principle 2, the intellectual quality of instruction and meaningful access. Principle 3, system conditions that support effectiveness. And Principle 4, alignment and articulation within and across all systems, knowing that each principle is supported by multiple elements. For today, I want us to take a look at Principle 1, which is assets-oriented and needs-responsive schools. Although all principles are inclusive of all English learners, including English learners with disabilities, Principle 1, Element E, calls out specifically a collaborative framework for English learners with disabilities. And here we look at valid assessment practices, IEPs that are culturally and linguistically inclusive, leveraging expertise specific to English learners, and academic goals that are linguistically appropriate. And yes, this is calling out the fact that this is a student who is an English learner and an English learner with a disability. However, a lot of these subpoints under Element E are critical for the pre-referral process. So I've mentioned the term multidisciplinary team quite a few times. And a multidisciplinary team, again, very self-explanatory, are teams that are built up by individuals who have levels of expertise in different areas. A lot of talk has taken place around de-siloing education, and I like to push back a little on that notion because I like to believe that silos are very much necessary. The same reason that you go to an orthopedic surgeon and not a podiatrist, that you go to a gastroenterologist and not just your general practitioner, is the same reason why we need experts. We need individuals with depth of understanding so that we can then connect. And I think that's where the challenge is and how it is that we connect these silos effectively to be able to build our collective expertise. And one of the starting points in doing that is by engaging in this collective commitment. A collective commitment and understanding that the work that we do is a shared responsibility between schools, parents, families, district professionals, specifically if we are trying to promote educational equity that ensures that all English learners are able to participate in high quality teaching and learning experiences. And to set the context further on that, I'm going to hand it over to Jessica to take you over some data points that will help us understand the importance of that multidisciplinary team in the pre-referral process.
Awesome, thank you, Vanessa. So as she mentioned, as we're moving along, we're going to set some context before we move into some of the resources a little bit later. So why are we here? Multilingual learners are present across the education system and in all work in California. We have very diverse learners. And within our English learners, we have some intersectionality. We have 6 out of 10 children that are between the ages of 0 to 5, so our early learners that are dually identified or dual language learners. We have our students that are within the socially economically disadvantaged students. 1 in 4 are also English learners. And then 1 in 4 students that have disabilities are also English learners. So a lot of mixed intersectionality there. And so within our English learners, we're diverse within, right? We have students that are newly coming into the schools. They might have some adequate schooling prior. We have some students that come in with limited formal schooling, students that are developing normally. Also, long-term English learners, we'll look at that in a little bit, and at risk, and then our English learners with disabilities. So we have some data that we're going to take some time to look at and hopefully kind of open our eyes to some things that are happening or what things look at our own LEA and school sites. Within this first pie graph, we have students with disabilities. This reflects across California. This is data that represents California as a whole. So within our students with disabilities, we talked about how there's also English learners, right? So 24% are also English learners. The other 64.5, English only, students with disabilities. 23.5, we have our students with disabilities that are also English learners, also called dually identified. So we want to take a moment for you to reflect on your own LEA and school site. What does that look like? Okay. Do you know that information? Does it look the same? Thumbs up. Does it not look the same? Thumbs down. Or is it, I don't know. And it's okay if we don't know. Okay, that's why we're here. I'm gonna give you guys a second to think about it. If you are our Zoom friends in the chat, you can do thumbs up, thumbs down, IDK if we're not sure, and that's okay. What do we see?
we're seeing some thumbs up in the chat, some thumbs up emojis.
Okay. So yeah, this is the numbers across the state, but sometimes we do see that it reflects our local data. Sometimes we'll see that our English learner numbers are a little bit higher than that or even lower, okay? So if you don't know this information or have access to this data, start thinking about who can we reach out to. Vanessa talked about how this is a collective commitment and we need a multidisciplinary team. We need multiple people in the room to be able to have these conversations. So start thinking about who can we reach out to get access to this data. All right. Another pie graph for you guys. This is our statewide English learners. So we're looking at English learners only, not with disabilities. And on the green, we have RFEP, which is our students that are reclassified as fluent English proficient. And that number sits at 46.2, so about 46% of our students that are English learners are reclassified as fluent English proficient. Okay. In the blue, it says English learners 0 to 3, and that's not 0 to 3 years of age, but rather 0 to 3 years of being in schooling. Okay. They're designated as English learner, and they've received anywhere between 0 to 3 years of schooling. And then we have red, which is our English learners, again, not 4 to 5 years old, but rather 4 to 5 years within school. And then again in the yellow, it's 6 or more years within school, okay, and designated as English learners. Again, take a moment to think about it. What does it look at your LEA, your school site? Is it the same, thumbs up, different, thumbs down, or in the middle? I don't know. It definitely does take a little digging. This is from DataQuest, and it takes a little bit looking into and figuring out what those numbers are. Of course, again, it's knowing the right people or working with the right people that'll be able to explain it to us. How are we looking in the Zoom room?
Individuals are sharing that a lot of the information that they see here has been on the California School Dashboard, casschooldashboard.org. And then I'm also typing up a response saying that, of course, DataQuest is a great resource. It does take some digging and organizing and downloading data, but it's important to do so. So if you have an opportunity to establish some data chats locally within your multidisciplinary teams, I think this is a worthy task to engage in, just because it informs a lot of our practices.
Yes, definitely. And again, looking at it from who's in those conversations. All right, so we talked about those 6+ years within schooling that are English learners, as well as the 4 to 5. We saw that on the previous slide in the red and the yellow. And we have some terms that we use when we're looking at those students. So a student that has been enrolled in school for 6+ years and is an English learner, they're considered a long-term English learner, which is an LTEL. Also, you know the acronyms. And then we have our students that are enrolled for 4 to 5 years that are considered at risk of LTEL. So they're not quite yet to that 6+, but they're at risk, right? They're not making that significant progress and haven't been eligible for reclassification. And now, just because of the years that they're enrolled in school, between 4 to 5 or 6 years, that tends to be around that junior high school level when we start having that sense of urgency that we have these LTELs, that we need these students that are still designated as English learners that we need to reclassify. But really, we want to take a look at those earlier years and look at those interventions and the supports that we have that are not maybe that are possibly not present, and we're leading to these students that are being designated as English learners for 4 or more years. So now we get some comparison data between our English learners with disabilities and our English learners without disabilities. And we saw this pie chart on the left, the English learners with disabilities previously. We see that RFEP, 46.2%. It's a little different there. Blue is those English learners that are 0 to 3 years, and so on. And now we have the same for our English learners with disabilities. Green is our RFIP, about 31.1%, blue, and so on. So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to look at the data and kind of, what are your wonderings? What are some things that you might notice? Are there things that are in common? Do you notice any differences? I'll go ahead and give you guys a minute to think about that. All right. What do you guys think? What are some noticings or wonderings? Do we have anything from our Zoom friends?
So a couple of the reflections that we see here is that too many students are staying English learners and not reclassifying. Also that it seems like, based on the pie chart, that English learners with disabilities have more difficulty reclassifying.
Perfect. So looking at that yellow, not necessarily just the yellow, the blue, red, and yellow, it's greater, right, for our English learners with disabilities. They're staying as, remaining as English learners with disabilities for a longer period of time, or more so than our English learners without disabilities. Yep.
Another point that's made here in the chat is that the graph matches to what they're seeing in their local LEA, and that perhaps the long-term English learner student group includes a higher number of students with disabilities, and also that it may take longer for EL students to reclassify. And then a very good question is, what are we using to reclassify? Is this with domain exemptions? Is this without domain exemptions? So there are quite a few questions that remain unanswered just by looking at data. And one of the points that we like to make with Project Muse when we engage in data talks is that data can tell many stories, right? It's about the framing, and it's about how high up the view is. Is it 30,000 foot view? Is it 20,000 foot view? Is it street level? What kind of data points are we looking at? And remembering that this EVER-EL data comparison between students who are English learners without disabilities and English learners with disabilities is just for that one period of time, and there is no accounting for the amount of variables present in our educational day. However, I do want to point out that this year, we saw a growth in the number of English learners with disabilities who are reclassifying, and we like to think that is due to the fact that a lot of LEAs are applying now what has been available, though wasn't readily known by many, which were the domain exemptions, as it was pointed out in the chat. Also knowing that now with the alternate LPAC being operational, a lot of more students are having access to using that assessment if they have the most significant cognitive disabilities and are English learners, to be able to attain that overall 3 and satisfy criteria 1 for reclass.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, so a lot of different ways that we can read the data, and it depends on what lens we bring, right? And Vanessa brought this up in regards to alternate LPAC. When I look at that reclassification data for the English learners with disabilities, I worked with the students with extensive support needs and went through the process of when we had our locally determined assessment, we were doing the VCALPs locally, and it was really hard to reclassify our students because they weren't able to meet the criteria per that assessment. But now that we have the alternate LPAC, in the last few years, as we've seen that locally, our reclassification rate has gone up, and hopefully it continues to do so as we get better as test administrators with providing the assessment, as well as using resources. Yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. Thank you.
All right, we have a question from one of our folks here.
Something that I think is really important to point out is that I'm currently administering the LPAC, the summative LPAC. And I'm the one who put in all of the accommodations and modifications for all of the students that are taking the test. One thing that this year happened that hasn't happened in years past, but it only happened with a handful of kids, was that there were domain exemptions placed for the students in specific areas where we knew that it was the disability that was causing them issue as opposed to the language. And so I think that that's something that we need to explore more throughout the state, is providing those domain exemptions based on the student's needs or disabilities or areas of specific need, in order to make sure that they are able to RFEP, instead of just assuming, oh, we're going to make them take all 4 domains when they have an auditory processing issue and they have to take a listening test. Or something to that effect. We need to be more mindful and more thoughtful about providing those exemptions.
I think you said it beautifully.
We did not pay her, folks.
So yes, definitely taking a look at domain exemption. Taking a look at domain exemption, but more than just saying like, where can we make it easier for the student, but really looking at the student's specific needs and how is the disability impacting their ability to access the assessment, right? So she mentioned maybe there's a language disorder and it really impacts the speaking portion. And if we can find data on that and we can find that it is truly impacting, then definitely we look at that domain exemption and see if that we can get that student to go ahead and show what they truly know in those areas and make progress, okay? All right, I know that some of you have already done this, but just again, think about what does that data look like in your LEA or school site? Is it the same? Is it different? I don't know. And if we don't know, who do we need to reach out to? Okay. So here we have a list of the English learners with disabilities by qualifying disabilities. You can see we have in the first column the disability, one of those 13 distinct qualifying disability categories, the percentage of those students. So again, looking at our duly identified students, our English learners with disabilities, the percentage of those that fall within that category, and the number of students. And again, this is a reflection of statewide. So our top 3 disability categories for our English learners are specific learning disability, which is our SLD, speech or language improvement, SLI, or autism. Okay? So that's about 75% of our students that are duly identified that fall within those 3 disability categories. And I want you guys to go ahead and take a second to think about those statistics. What is something that they have in common, or what is something that you might notice or wonder about it? I'll give you guys a few seconds to think about that. Based off of whatever lens you bring to today, your background knowledge, what are some things that these have in common? Righty. Any noticing, Zoom friends?
I want to address a question in the Q&A. If there are parameters for the domain exemptions, and are there consequences to districts putting in too many? So we do want to call out the fact that domain exemptions happen within the context of the IEP. So it would take place in the IEP team meeting with that IEP team, which is your multidisciplinary team, engaged and taking a look at A, the disability, B, the manifestation of the disability, C, how the disability manifests across domains, D, utilizing guidance from CDE to establish whether a domain exemption is necessary when looking at also historical LPAC data that would support the discussion around domain exempting, let's say, speaking for a student who over the course of 4 years, despite exhausting all accommodations, universal tools, designated supports, any combination of those, having a linguistically appropriate goals and objectives written in that area, ensuring that comprehensive ELD, both integrated and designated ELD, has been provided that is of quality and is consistent. And despite all that, going back to that psychological, psychoeducational assessment with the participation of your EL specialist and the IEP team members, that determination is made that this, in fact, following CDE guidance, is an appropriate domain exemption, because at this point, the IEP team can ensure that assessing that particular domain is tantamount to assessing the disability.
Yes, multiple layers, right? multiple layers. All right. Any ideas or comments or wonderings in regards to the statistics here? Or is there anything that's they have in common? All right. So that's okay. So when we look at these three categories, we can also, what I see or what comes to mind is language, right? Language. Speech and language impairment, SLD, autism. There's some type of language component within each of those disability categories. And so one of the things that we want to think about is when we're assessing our students, and not to say that this isn't happening, but when we're assessing our students, we want to make sure that we're using linguistically and culturally appropriate assessment practices, right? So that we really make sure that we're not assessing the language difference and seeing it as a language disability or a disability, and that it's truly, if it is a language difference, that we're not qualifying them for a certain disability, okay? Again, think about these percentages. Is that something that's very similar to what's in your school site or LEA? Thumbs up, thumbs down. If you don't know, if you don't have access to that data, who can you reach out to? Right? And just knowing that language is the core of all curriculum, right? Whether you're participating in math, reading, writing, whatever it might be, language is really the core of a curriculum. And so our English learners, if they don't have those linguistic supports available in those interventions, it really impacts overall. And making sure, as we mentioned, that language difference versus disability is that we're truly identifying what are linguistic needs related to them being English learners and whether that is a disability, and looking at our practices. Okay, so this is just kind of a guiding question, is looking at, have we really reviewed what our practices are when we have this referral come in and the student is English learner and we're looking at it for disability? Do we take into consideration, are we consulting with English, maybe EL coordinators or people from the, we'll say, EL world, and collaborating between them with the special education side of the house? Okay. So we're going to take a moment to watch this video and listen to Dr. Alvaro Ortiz share a little bit of her insights of why she believes ELs or English learners are being referred to special education too soon. And while you're listening to it, she mentions a couple different trends that she's seeing, and think about it if those are things that you're seeing in your school as well. Okay?
When you look at over-identification, you get kind of the opposite face of the problem. In this case, people think that the problem is a disability and they don't consider linguistic or cultural differences or educational opportunity as contributors to the problem. And so they make a referral too quickly. And then you get into some really difficult issues. We don't have the assessment instruments that we need to make an accurate identification of disabilities among students who speak different languages. Even when you have assessment instruments available in Spanish, they may also be culturally and linguistically irrelevant for the student that you're concerned about. So the assessment instruments, you can take almost any student and assess them with the available tools, and they'll qualify because the instruments are inappropriate. Sometimes we make the decision that general education can't serve the needs of the student, particularly because we have populations of students that really have significant learning difficulties. If you look at students with interrupted formal schooling, for example, who come here as adolescents, haven't been in school or have had inconsistent schooling, the gap is so wide that the sentiment is that if you make a special education referral, the student will be with a teacher who has specialized skills, smaller classes, materials designed to close those significant gaps. And so special education can actually become a dumping ground for students who have significant difficulties for reasons other than the presence of a disability. So overrepresentation becomes a huge issue because we haven't been able to overcome what is oftentimes negative expectations associated with a disability. So the student over time does worse because they're not getting the appropriate instruction, because we may not have special education teachers who understand how to support the language and cultural needs of the student. So even though they're in this smaller class, the gap can widen because the instruction is inappropriate. So there are a lot of factors that contribute to overrepresentation. And I think one of the big issues for students is that once we put them in, we seldom let them out. And so we identify students as having disabilities very early, and then they can spend the rest of their school career in a special education program or receiving special education services, even though they don't have a disability.
All right. I think that phrase, once we put them in, we don't get them out, right? That one gets me. So thinking about the different trends that she mentioned, do you see any of those trends happening at your LEA or at your school site? Give you guys a second to think about that. Or maybe even the practices that they have. Any thoughts? All right. So thinking about the different things of the assessment practices, making sure that they're linguistically and culturally appropriate. I think the fact that looking that a little bit deeper, even though they might be titled as, linguistically appropriate, are they truly so? And we have some comments from some Zoom friends, so we'll go to them.
So we have a great comment here, and it says, if we are strictly using standardized testing and not dynamic assessments, qualifications are going to be higher. Also, sometimes when requesting SSTs for students who are English learners, with the suspicion that there might be a disability present, making sure that your team is prepared to make that distinction between language difference of an English learner and a potential disability.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. So definitely the California Practitioners Guide tells us that children with diverse language backgrounds, they may fall back behind in academic English environments. We've been talking about that, right? We got to make sure without those effective instruction and pre-referral interventions and supports, they could potentially be referred to special education and labeled as having a disability. Even though it may truly just be a language difference, and as Dr. Ortiz mentioned, it could be that they haven't received formal instruction and there's a large gap, and then automatically you're pushed into special education thinking they're going to be taken care of, right? But in actuality, that gap continues to grow. So Chapter 3 of the California Practitioners Guide really focuses on that special education referral for students that are English learners. And some of the, as the way it's set up, the Practitioners Guide, for each chapter, it provides these guiding questions to kind of just ground you in what the work is. And it's separated for teachers, and then there's also questions for administrators. I'm just going to go ahead and review a couple of them. And these are some questions that we can think about as we go forward today. What are some of those pre-referral steps that should be documented to ensure that special education referral for an English learner is appropriate? What information do I need from parents, so including our parents, to help me determine if a referral for special education is appropriate? What input can we get from them? What data do I need to collect to make sure that the referral is appropriate? For administrators, some questions are, what is the process to ensure that a special education referral for an English learner is appropriate and that does not lead to the over or under identification of an English learner for special education services? So we're talking about a lot about over referral, but we also want to keep an eye on the under identification. And how do I ensure that I meet the state and federal child find requirements for English learners? So some of those guiding questions. On the right-hand side, you'll see an infographic. It's a nice long infographic, but basically that is your Chapter 3 of the Practitioner's Guide. It has several linked resources within there, and if you don't have time to flip through the Practitioner's Guide, you can go ahead and use this resource to kind of get an idea of what that chapter is about, and it takes you through that process. It's available on our website as well as linked in this slide deck. Just a little bit more about that chapter 3. It really focuses on addressing the value of those, identifying those factors in the instructional environment, the English language proficiency progress, and the effect on academic progress, and really looking at all the data regarding intervention, behavioral and health, the extrinsic factor, making sure that we're ruling out the extrinsic factors so that we can have appropriate referrals to special education. And of course, this is a team lift. And I know Vanessa talked about that earlier as a collective commitment. It really is a team lift because when we're looking at data, when we're looking at building that comprehensive picture of a student, we can't come from one side of the house, right? Me, I come from the special education background. Walking in and learning about English learners was really new to me, and I feel like I can get a better picture. But when I came from special education, I didn't really know a lot about ELD instruction, right? I didn't have a lot of information regarding LTELs and at risk of LTELs, but really coming together as a team to make sure we have that well-rounded conversation. So we'll talk just a few minutes about an MDT approach, which is our multidisciplinary team approach, and again, promoting that collaboration between special education educators as well as English learner specialists and integrating those services of both. One doesn't trump the other. We want to make sure that we're integrating and working together. And so we've seen data, right? Data. But if we don't really have access, it depends on our role, it depends on the permissions, what different systems are out there. And it's really important that we reach out and find out who has access to it, right? You can get things from DataQuest, that's pretty much open, and we showed some data from that. But CalPads, you might have that one CalPads person that has access to it. IEP vendors, so people that are within the special education or services, they'll have access. Student information system, ARIES, Synergy. And then I think an underutilized tool is that assessment management system, TOMS, right? It holds a lot of data. But again, you might not have access to all of these, so it's really important to reach out and figure out who has access, make a friend, get some data, and go beyond just receiving that data though and having really deep conversations about them. MDTs can really be at any level. You have your SST, you have your IEP MDTs, you might have it at a district level, LEA, so on and so forth, but we really want to look at and see who's there. If we have an SST team and we only have general education present, are we really seeing the other side of the house, right? No, right? We're not having representation maybe from the special education. If that student is an English learner, who should be there? Someone from the ELD department, right? An ELD coordinator, a ELD TOSA, someone that's going to represent those and be able to share on those needs, okay? And then we also think about what if there's some behavioral challenges? They're being referred for an SST, there's some behavioral challenges, some mental health issues going on. Who should be there? Maybe a counselor, okay? And really making sure that we're pulling back and looking at what those students' needs are and helping and providing that support before we say, you know what, they need to go to special education, okay? So in doing that, by building that multidisciplinary team, we can build a comprehensive picture of what that student's true needs are. We can bring in looking at their culture, their ethnicity, their race, their personality, all those things that make what a student is or a child is beyond the facts and numbers. So we're not just looking at their LPAC score. If the student has a disability, we're not just looking at their disability, right? We really want to get to know what the students are, their background, and their abilities. Okay. So I think we're going to go ahead and we're 4 minutes early, but we're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break. And then we're going to come back and talk a little bit about those Tier 1 considerations and some of that first best instruction. All right? So have a nice break, and we'll be back at 9:36. Right? Enjoy your break.
All right, everybody, welcome back. Thank you so much for sticking with us and coming back for Tier 1 considerations, aka first best instruction. So when we talk about Tier 1 core, first best instruction, we oftentimes think of universally designing lessons. We're looking at those foundational concepts that come into our lesson design, meaning that we consider learner variability. Learner variability is the norm. It's contextual. However, it can be predictable and it can be planned for. Also understanding that the barrier is in the design, not the learner. What may be necessary for one is potentially good for all. Knowing that at the end of the day, the goal of UDL is learner agency. And learner agency is important for all students. So what is variability? When we talk about variability, variability is very much the norm. There is no such thing as average. Hence Dr. Todd Rose's book, The Myth of Average. Variability is the term used to describe just how unique and varied our brains are. No two learners activate the same pathways in the brain. Vanessa, what does this mean for this conversation that we've been having around setting the context with data? Well, that learner variability exists there as well. We touched upon earlier whether knowing that some of that reclassification data was inclusive of domain exemptions. Domain exemptions are really a manifestation of learner variability, even in the manifestation of an individual disability. So thinking of variability, these are all the different layers of variability that are inclusive of identity. We're not just looking at age, sexual orientation, ethnicity, race, gender, physical abilities or qualities, but we also have communication styles, communication skills. We're also looking at religious beliefs, socioeconomics, geographic locations, political ideology, creed, etc., etc. And all of these figure in how it is that we engage with our students. Thinking back to element 1E of the EL Learner Roadmap, remember, inclusive of all students, right? We are addressing variability through our system. And when we're looking at Tier 1 core first best instruction, we're moving away, especially when we're considering pre-referral, from starting our conversation around the myth of that imaginary average. So when we are looking at making referrals for that pre-referral process, are we considering variability or that myth of average? So having established that when we're looking at the whole child, the entire student, that robust learner profile, that is going to help us make more appropriate pre-referral determinations. So let's jump into it. We start off with this graphic not to show you a pathway to special education. That's not what this is about. This is more about considerations prior to referrals for special education eligibility. So let's clarify a couple of things. There's pre-referral, which is your Tier 1 core first best instruction inclusive of differentiation. Student isn't making progress. We enter into a process, whether it be the SST process, the MTSS process, however you have it organized at your LEA. And we typically enter this process when a referral is made by a parent, a guardian, or a counselor. Now we're officially in that pre-referral process. So making that initial referral for the SST or the MTSS process does not guarantee a referral for assessment. Two very different things. What we're going to be focusing in on is Part 1 and Part 2 and Part 3, prior to even looking at referral for SPED assessment. So that pre-referral, Tier 1, core, first best instruction, inclusive of differentiation. And we're gonna do a little bit more myth busting as we move along, because I think it's important to recognize that what we sometimes think something means isn't necessarily what it means. So let's start with this graphic. So we're going to start with conversations around pre-referral, meaning some of the activities that we complete as a team, that we complete as an individual, that we consider about the student prior to moving forward with that referral, potential referral for special education services. So as we mentioned earlier, once we've established that core instruction has not been sufficient for the student, inclusive of differentiation, then a referral is made to kick off this pre-referral process. So that pre-referral process is made by a staff member, a parent, a guardian, a counselor, anybody. So I want us to use this time right now to reflect on who makes up your multidisciplinary team. For your student study success team, your student study team, or your MTSS team. Take some time, think about it, and share with your partner if you're here in person. If you're joining us in Zoom, drop it in the chat. Who makes up your SST, MTSS, multidisciplinary team? Is it just you and an admin? Is it 5 individuals? Does it change? Who's there? Who's part of your team? If you use a database, if you use an internal document, beyond SST, any other vendors, how do we keep track as to who makes those referrals? And once that referral is made, who is there to review it? Okay. Do we have any insights from our chat, Jessica?
Yes, so we have counselor, teacher, parent. That's a very common one. Principal, maybe a general education teacher. A lot of very inconsistent, so.
Okay. Okay, so let's say that that referral is made by a parent. Who receives that initial referral? Hopefully it's your coordinator, right? The one person who's in charge. Is there any follow-up to that initial referral before we move forward with a meeting? Do we have a conversation or do we immediately call a meeting? What are some of the procedures that we have in place? Okay, so the question was who initiates or who does the initial follow-up? Once the coordinator receives the referral, if I understood you correctly, then the counselor makes that initial touch point, and then based on that initial connection with the parent, what is that, with the parent or with the teacher or with the person who referred? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Perfect. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. And usually to match up with the area of need, right? What is, okay, perfect. So just to share out with our Zoom friends, the comment was that it depends also greatly on what the referral is for or who the student is. So if the student is an English learner, then the English learner specialist, the English learner teacher, the ELD teacher, or the ELD or the EL TOSA is one of those initial touch points as well. Another one was if the area of concern is directly related to, let's say, math, then a general education math teacher would also be invited to have conversations about how to best support the student. Because we also have to remember that whenever a referral is made, it may be due to something that is completely unrelated to academics, and there's no way for us to know that unless we start having conversations with multiple individuals that might have insights into the process or the individual that we do not have. Jessica, I see that there is something else to share.
Yeah, just along the same lines of like your SST team might look different based on different needs. Mm-hmm. So we have an academic SST, so an academic coordinator goes, a general education teacher, a parent, and a principal. Whereas a behavioral SST might be a character coordinator, a counselor, principal, gen ed, general education teacher, and then the parent. And the
Perfect.
referrals usually go to their school psychologist.
Perfect. So in some places, the school psychologist is the coordinator. In other places, it's the school counselor. Some LEAs have an MTSS coordinator. Some other districts might have different roles, different titles, but basically one of the duties is that, right, to oversee that SST process. And I'd like to spend some time having this conversation because it's important for us to recognize that depending on what that whatever prompted that individual to submit that referral, you want to match the individuals in your MDT team to that area of concern, right? So you want to make sure that you have a robust team and that it's not just you, the coordinator, sitting across the gen ed teacher, having a two-way conversation. Because again, if I'm honest, thinking back to my experience prior to coming to the SELPA, I spent 18 years at our local district, and sometimes it was just 2 or 3 individuals having a conversation that wasn't necessarily aligned to what the initial concern was, or it was 3 individuals sitting there with not all of the data points necessary to have an informed conversation. So I'm very heartened to hear and see that many of you are really building your multidisciplinary teams to be responsive to that initial area of referral. And another thing is also data, and I mentioned it briefly just a little while ago. Do we have the information necessary to address those targeted needs via the team process? And we want to start by asking ourselves, what does student data look like? What might it be? Where might I find it? So I want you to use this time also for my in-person participants here to talk to your elbow partners, what type of data you utilize, what it looks like, and where you might access this from. And the same prompt for our folks joining us on Zoom. What does student data look like when identifying a student's targeted needs via the team process? Go ahead and take a minute to do that. What does student data look like? Let me go to the back and grab a mic, and then I can just leave it up here so we can just have it closer. So what does data look like? Are there any?
Yes, so in our Zoom friends, we have someone sharing that they use classroom assessments, observations, and any district performance assessments such as iReady and a Cadence. Another one shared that they're supposed to use Beyond SST, but the reality is that not everybody is using it.
All right, so is it always a spreadsheet? No, it could be many things. It could be formal observation data, informal observation data. It could be a student report from iReady. It could be a work sample, multiple work samples over time. It could be many things. Student data does not have a cookie cutter formula. You need as many bits of information and data points as possible to be able to truly identify targeted needs via the team process, hoping that we avoid this scattershot approach where we throw every single intervention possible and perhaps miss the mark from what the true area of need is. Which then takes us to our intervention summary component. So we've established who's made that initial referral. We've considered the types of data samples that we're going to gather to have this discussion. And we are going to start outlining pre-referral activities that take into account progress monitoring and data collection, and considering this super important one for our EL students who are in this process. What does designated and integrated ELD look like for this student? Super important. And the age-old million-dollar question, Are the needs related to a language difference or a disability? Spoiler alert, I don't have the black and white answer for that. Just letting you know up front. So spend some time talking to your elbow partner if you're here in person, your table partners, or in the chat, using the chat feature for my Zoom friends. What are some of the ways that you progress monitor and collect data? You don't have to answer all three. Or how do you establish what ELD looks like for the student, meaning both integrated and designated? And what steps does your team take to try to tease out if this is a language difference or a potential indicator of a disability? Take a minute to have that discussion. Okay, so briefly, what might progress monitoring and data collection look like? Or what have you seen used? It doesn't have to be your own personal experience, but what you've heard or what you've seen. What do we typically do?
Someone in the Zoom chat shared that they start with looking at the database, such as the the elevation, to see how many days the student has attended formal schooling. So are they a newcomer?
That's a really good one because, again, often overlooked, the impact of attendance, right? Because can we truly say that this is a potential disability when there hasn't been consistent schooling, right? Like if they're not having access to that. And that is considered what kind of a factor? An extrinsic factor, right? Yes.
What information you get from the CUME file. With the freshmen, one of the questions that I tend to ask the parents is, for freshmen, was your son or daughter socially promoted? Because when they say yes, then okay, you know that the problem started back in junior high, and that's, you know, the CUME file. That's where you find, you know, attendance, grades. So before, you know, we move forward to special education, let's look at the whole picture before.
I love that. I love that. And the CUME file can sometimes be overwhelming because there's so much information in there. But I feel like it's one of those things that once you train your eye to look for what you know you need to look at first, it gives you like a lot of really good information. And I like that you brought up elements such as social promotion, right? How many times has it happened, right? If it's just been a one-off thing, if we can figure out why that social promotion took place, oh, there was a death in the family, the student fell behind. Prior to that, they were making appropriate progress, so they were socially promoted. Oh, okay, that makes sense. That explains that portion. Now so just really being able to take a look at the whole picture is important.
This is just more as an aha for me. That third arrow becomes, I think, really blurred if you haven't, or if we haven't really looked at our, let's say, designated ELD, and you know what that's like for the students. And if we can take a look at that, make some observations there, then I think the next arrow then becomes less blurred.
That's such a great point to make because that whole notion of how making that distinction between a language difference and a disability becomes a lot easier to make that distinction, not 100%, but much easier if we can at least account for the provision of comprehensive ELD that is both consistent and of quality, right? So what does that look like? Because we know that language is at the core of all content. So if we're not developing that language adequately for students via quality, consistent, comprehensive ELD, then of course we're going to have a hard time differentiating between a language difference or a disability. Very insightful. Thank you for sharing that.
All right, our Zoom friends share that they look at, a couple people share that they're looking at that LPAC data, whether a student might be, they use the term flatlining, their scores haven't really changed over the couple years, Some use the previous year's LPAC data and really digging in and seeing, is the student making progress? Why, what area might they be not making progress in? Looking at whether students have been receiving tier 1 instruction. And then I do like this, very honest and open, is we don't really do it, right? We're putting students in ELD block and not really sure of what's happening there. And there's that collaboration that's missing.
Exactly, and we really appreciate your vulnerability in sharing that, because we always like to say that our Project Muse learning spaces are not safe spaces, rather they're brave spaces where we can share, because that's the only way that we can truly grow, is by being vulnerable and open and brave to share these responses. Because it happens with our work statewide. We've engaged in conversations where it's like, what's written doesn't match what we do. Or it says that we are monitoring every 6 weeks, but the quality of the data that we're gathering for that monitoring isn't there. Or we have an intervention that doesn't match the true root issue of what the problem is, the barrier, whatever that might be. So I appreciate them sharing that, because these are points that are highlighted so that we can start thinking about actionable next steps, no matter how small, are necessary upon recognizing that some of the areas might be missing. And if this is beyond your sphere of influence, who might you engage in conversation with, right? Because we recognize that we all have our individual sphere of influence, and as far as I know, there's no magic wand. If it were available, I'd be, like first on that mailing list. But it's a conversation that should really be happening. Anything else, Jessica, that's in the chat? Thank you so much, everyone, for participating and engaging. So we talked about all of these steps to lead into our conversation around the multi-tiered system of support, the instruction and intervention piece, though, not the entire framework, because we know that the MTSS framework is vast and comprehensive. Here we're only looking at the instruction and intervention tiers for students who are English learners, with the potential to be referred for special education assessment, not services. So it is important to have a clearly defined and established SST process that is going to support your pre-referral practices. Again, are your written practices matching your actions? If what we say is happening isn't necessarily happening in action at this moment, then we don't have a functional system. Because then we don't have the ability to establish those checkpoints and to truly have an MTSS framework that can be operationalized as your pre-referral process. So when we look at Tier 1 is all about core instruction, first best instruction, meaning everybody gets Tier 1, including students with disabilities. So Tier 1, we're monitoring and tracking academic and language acquisition growth. We're conducting universal screenings to determine risk levels. We're providing core research-based reading programs and ELD services if you're an English learner. So yes, folks, ELD is Tier 1 core instruction. It is not an intervention. So all of our English learner students are to receive comprehensive ELD as part of their Tier 1 first best instruction. Typically around 85% of our students, around there give and take, it's not a hard and fast number, are going to make adequate progress with Tier 1 instruction. And remember that Tier 1 includes differentiation. Differentiation is not Tier 2 or Tier 3. It's inclusive of Tier 1. Tier 2, here up the tiers, we're looking at research-based interventions, small groups, with more progress monitoring and data tracking. So one of the points that comes up often in conversation is like, oh my goodness, the thing is that around 70% of my kids are tier 2. What does that make you think? Mull that one over, use the chat, my Zoom friends. What would you respond to that comment? Most of my kids are tier 2. And then in person here, have a conversation amongst yourselves. What does that mean? So again, what might we need to unpack if we hear, well, like 70% of my students are at tier 2? What are some of the things that are surfacing? Jessica?
That tier 1 is not working. That there needs to be a revisit to the core instruction, because there shouldn't be more than about 20% of those students in tier 2.
Anything else different?
Sorry, we do have a little question, true or false. So a student, they have not been designated as a duly identified until after they've run the gamut of the MTSS pyramid. Is that true?
We'll get into that right now because in special education, nothing is ever simple. It's
Well
always
put.
gray, and we'll get into that. So yeah, like that initial statement pretty much sums it up. It's like, okay, if you have around 70% of your students in tier 2, let's revisit tier 1. Let's take a look at that first core best instruction that is available for all students. Because if 70% of your students are needing more intense interventions, that perhaps means that there needs to be some adjustment to that tier 1. And reflecting back to those UDL slides, right? Are we planning for the margins? Are we identifying the barrier in the task, not the individual, right? And are we planning for learner variability? So we're still in Gen Ed land, okay? Tier 2, we're still in Gen Ed land. Tier 3 is an intervention that occurs daily, where we have a lower student to teacher ratio, and there is intensive evidence-based intervention. So what we're looking at here is frequent progress monitoring and a longer duration of time, usually 80 to 100 hours of intervention. Over time, of course, not in one sitting. So if you want to imagine a number, around 80% of your students are going to make progress just with tier 1 first core best instruction with differentiation. Around 15 to 20% might move up to tier 2 to need tier 2 interventions. And around 5% are going to make their way to that tier 3, where we're having more intensive interventions, more frequent progress monitoring. And guess what? We're still in Gen Ed land. Tier 1 Gen Ed, Tier 2 Gen Ed, Tier 3 Gen Ed. How do we make those determinations on how to move from one tier to another? The MTSS process, right? That's what we utilize to make those determinations, those decisions. Just because you're in tier 2 for reading comprehension doesn't mean that you're going to be a tier 2 intervention needs student for the entire school year. So this process is fluid. We're looking at data, which is again why progress monitoring is part of the description of the tiers, because in order to do it appropriately, you have to have that data and that capacity to be looking at it, to be able to have students move as necessary. Because it is possible for a student to receive Tier 1 instruction and receive Tier 2 for a particular area and Tier 3 for another, okay? It is possible, I'm not saying it's simple, but we do see it with some students because what? Learner variability, right? So outside of trying Tier 1 first best instruction, a student is having some difficulty, we take it up to Tier 2 to provide that targeted intervention in reading comprehension. We provide frequent progress monitoring. We provide those hours of support. Still isn't making progress, so we up them into a Tier 3 intervention with more frequent progress monitoring for a longer period of time. No progress is being made. We've had a series of meetings to review the data points, the progress monitoring conversations. All of this is still the SST process. It might be at this point now where we're thinking, you know what, despite multiple interventions over a period of time and progress monitoring consistently, let's look at that referral. Now, that being said, Tier 3 is not your pathway to special education. Some kiddos will need it, and we're not saying don't refer. All we're saying is that if you are trialing interventions and if you have an MTSS system that is clearly established, potentially you're going to go through the tiers prior to making that referral. We can't forget though that we have child find requirements. So IDEA calls out that if there is an area of suspected disability, it is the LEA's responsibility to find that child and provide the services that are necessary. So if there is a legitimate concern that a disability is present, we must assess to determine if that disability is there. Any questions in the chat, Jessica?
Just some wonderings about how long were the school districts keeping students at each tier? Were they reassessing? Were they looking at the students' needs, whether they should be going
And
up
the
and
answer
down?
is, it depends, right? In special education and in Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 interventions, it's really going to depend because here's just a quick student vignette. Student A is identified to have an area of need in mathematical fluency, okay? So they're receiving Tier 2 intervention. It's been 6 months and no progress, right? Yet when we're reviewing the progress monitoring data, there was inconsistent collection of data. And it just so happened that intervention time coincided with a variety of school assemblies that took place during that period of time. So it turns out that out of the 120 sessions that should have taken place, only 60 took place. So yeah, maybe you monitored for 3 months, but was the provision of that intervention consistent and of quality, right? So there are multiple variables in that equation that we must account to, but there is nothing legally, if that's the question, that states that a student must have received X amount of hours prior to.
There was also just a question about the percentage again, because they want to go back and look at their own local data. So again, that Tier 1 is about 80%.
Yeah, 80 to 85,
80.
15 to 20.
And then about
yeah,
5%
about
for
5%.
Tier 3. Perfect. And then there was a question regarding that Tier 3. I know it's, recommendation 80 to 100 hours. That's that consistent intervention that should be occurring how
Daily.
often? And it's not over necessarily a year. It's just when those 80 to 100 hours are met.
Right. And so, and one of the points that, and again, it's going to, so underlying all of this is, number one, Do you have these interventions identified in your district? Like, does everybody know that for tier 2, this is what's available? Do we have a listing of what our tier 2s are? Do we have a listing of what our tier 3s are? Right? What is the data we're going to be collecting depending on that area of need? So I'll give you an example. I was coordinating SSTs for the school site that I worked at, and having a conversation with a new teacher comes in and she says, you know what, like my student can't read. I'm like, okay, like tell me more about that. Well, yeah, they can't read. Like I give them the book and like they just can't read, 3rd grade teacher. They just can't read. And I'm like, okay, so what do you suspect? Do you suspect it's like phonemic awareness, phonics, decoding, fluency? I don't know, they just don't read. Okay, so it's like, okay, yes, you know, like I think we've established that the student can't read, but what else? And so it made me go back to like, okay, so there's like an element of education that still needs to happen. Like when we're talking about the reading process, which is very nuanced and difficult, God bless those 2nd and 3rd grade teachers that teach our kids to read, because it's a difficult process to teach. And if we're not aware as teachers as to what makes up reading, then we can't have a targeted intervention. Because what if this child just needed support in decoding? And I started using a program that was about building phonemic awareness. Yeah, it would help, but it's not targeted to that specific area of need, right? Or if the student is having difficulty with reading comprehension, how do I know that it's not related to utilizing context because they're missing some language? So the support necessary there might be more related to ELD than to building fluency, right? So again, very important conversations to be had. Anything else, Jessica, that's come up? Okay, perfect. So again, it looks simple, it looks cute. Here's this little Christmas tree with a star at the top, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. But really, it's multi-tiered and multi-layered and very nuanced. Dually identified students retain tier 1 core instruction, including comprehensive ELD. And we put that in there because that's another one that we hear often. It's like, oh, well, yeah, once they qualified for SPED, they don't get ELD anymore. They get that through SPED services. No. English learners, when they're identified as having a disability, retain tier 1 as their core, part of their core instruction. And it's not only integrated ELD, it's both integrated and designated ELD. Students who are English learners, including those who are dually identified, may access tier 2 and tier 3 interventions, which includes comprehensive ELD. Because ELD is core instruction, you could receive intervention support in tier 2, tier 3. Whether it is through the support of a TOSA, an exchange program, however it is that your school has it structured, they may access tier 2 and tier 3 in ELD if needed. And the reminder is always that special education is a service that lives outside the tiers. So it's a service, it's not a place, it's not a person. Specialized academic instruction. That's what special education service means in the context of our classroom setting when they receive either pull out or push in support by an ed specialist. So I've made mention about comprehensive ELD and how it's both. For some of my special education friends or individuals that haven't received enough information necessary to understand the nuance around Title III requirements, I just want to give you some information. So So when I talk about comprehensive ELD in the state of California, we're talking about two. We're talking about integrated ELD and designated ELD, okay? Because sometimes we get the comment of like, oh yeah, we do ELD. It's integrated in our ELA curriculum. That's integrated ELD. You're still responsible for designated ELD. So when we're doing integrated ELD, this is regular class time, math, language arts, science, where the ELD standards are used in tandem with the focal standards, which in this case are your Common Core State standards for ELA, math, science, etc. Whereas designated ELD is a protected time during the regular school day where teachers use the ELD standards as the focal standards. Meaning that during this time, I'm using the ELD standards as my guide. That's what I'm teaching. I'm teaching those ELD standards. And I want to call out the fact that it says protected time, but it doesn't specify how long that time is. So it can be anywhere from 30 minutes, 45, 20 minutes, so long as it's a protected time where you are using the ELD standards as your focal standards for instruction. Yes. Yes. I don't know that there's like a minimum requirement, but I know for many years, so I was an EL coach at one point in one of our districts, and for some reason we don't know where we saw it, but like we made it 45 minutes mandatory. And so it was really tough because we couldn't make it fit like within our schedule for those 45 minutes consistent. And then later we learned that it's just a protected time. Like there's no minimum or maximum of minutes, so long as that during that protected time, the ELD standards are your focal standards. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I just wanted to share with our Zoom friends what the question was, and that was just whether that is the LEA's decision to determine what that protected time looks like, and the answer was yes.
Yes, yes. So there's no minimum requirement, like there's no like, oh no, like everybody needs to get at least 20 minutes or at most 60 minutes. As far as I know, there is no numerical value minutes-wise attached to that protected time. And if anybody knows otherwise, please drop it in the chat if you have any citations for that, because I want to make sure that I'm giving you the correct information. But as far as I know, there's no minimum maximum. Okay. And so here we go back to ELD school. And for some of our friends joining us on Zoom where EL is your bread and butter, like this is what you do, please drop your insights into the chat so you can share with your peers any resources that come to the surface, any wonderings or any +1 value added statements are welcome all the time, because if this is old hat for you, bear with me. For my friends where this is the first time that you've seen this, we're gonna jump into it. So, to give you a quick visual, because I think visuals are super helpful when we're having new learning. We've been talking about ELD, comprehensive ELD, designated, integrated, and the ELD standards. Well, a lot of the information that we gather from assessments for English learners that are going to be informing our SST process, our pre-referral process, our MTSS process, are going to be very much linked to the LPAC. Yes, the LPAC is one assessment, one snapshot in time. We should not be using this as our sole data piece. There are multiple pieces that we want to look at. Think back to our conversation about what data points we're looking at when we're looking at student profiles in our SST process. But important for us to know is that the LPAC, the OG LPAC, this is not the alternate, the OG LPAC, assesses 4 domains, 4 language domains: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So when a student takes the LPAC, they are going to be given test items that are going to help us determine where they are in regards to listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Those are the 4. You can generate individual scores by domain. A score for listening, a score for speaking, a score for reading, a score for writing. Combine those 4 together and that generates your overall LPAC score. So it's possible to have 2, 3, 4, 2 and still generate a 3. When we report scores, like I mentioned, you get the overall and then the ones by domain, but you also generate a score for performance areas. There is an oral language composite, follow that orange arrow across the top, and the oral language composite is inclusive of speaking and listening. So when you're looking at the oral language composite, it's a combination of those 2 domains. Bottom orange arrow, written language composite, we have reading and writing. When we're looking at that student score report, and we're going to see one in a little bit, you'll see that the written language composite is inclusive of reading and writing domains. Why is this important? This is important because when we're having our conversations in our pre-referral meetings, looking at where a student is academically, language-wise, socially, emotionally, behaviorally, it's going to be important for us to know where they are, not just overall in the LPAC, but by domain, and see if we can start connecting the dots between the identified area of need and that initial referral to any one of these domains. Why? Because that may also be helpful should the student end up in a situation where the team is assessing for special education eligibility, and based on the assessment protocols, the psychoeducational evaluation, the team discussion, the team determines that indeed a disability is present and it is identified, you already have documented information that indicates that certain domains are suppressed or are posing a challenge for the student, right? And it is helpful for then the IEP team to develop goals and develop an IEP that is taking into account where the student is in their language development. So all of that is very important because the correlation is as follows. The LPAC has those 4 performance levels, a 1, 2, 3, or a 4, that align to the ELD standards proficiency level. There's emerging, expanding, and bridging. If you notice, level 3, moderately developed on the LPAC, aligns with the ELD standards proficiency levels that are both expanding and bridging, meaning that they require moderate to light linguistic support depending on task and purpose. And that is important for us to note because when we have a student before us in the SST process, their student file, their profile, and we're getting to know where the student is, we also want to take into account where they are in their stages of English language development. And having a tool like the LPAC to give us that initial understanding of where the student is overall and by domain, and also after we've taken a look at provision of integrated ELD and designated ELD, we have a clearer picture of where the student lands across this spectrum of language development. Are they more at that native language end? Are they more at that emerging level, expanding, bridging? Or are we at that point where they are lifelong language learners? So all of that very important to our conversation, and we're going to continue it further by digging a little deeper, yes, deeper, when we come back from break. It is 10:29, bordering on 10:30. I will give you 11 minutes, and I will see you back at 10:40 and pick up our conversation then. See you in a bit. Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully that break was long enough for you to take care of the things you need to take care of so that we can continue on our learning. And we are very much on time to break off for lunch at 11:30. So if you need to start making lunch plans, you can go ahead and start doing that right now so that you can have your full 60 minutes to enjoy your meal. All right. So we spent some time talking about how the LPAC is assessed, the language domains, how to generate an overall score, and also looking at the alignment between the LPAC proficiency levels and the ELD standards. So one of the resources that I think is incredibly helpful when we're taking a look at data points that we might bring into our pre-referral process is taking a look at the student report for the LPAC. So you'll see that this is an assessment for the summative. The assessment is the summative LPAC, and this is a fictional student. And here we are going to look at a couple of points in this form that give us some relevant information. So this is the overall. The overall is a 3, highlighted there by the arrow. The score is 1550, which is moderately developed. So that's one bit of info that I can glean from this document. Next, if I want to know more about what my student could do at a level 3, let's look at that second arrow. That second arrow tells us that the score span 1517 through 1566 leaves you at level 3, which is moderately developed. And this is a student who can usually use English to learn new concepts in school. Great, this is good information, but I'm not going to use it as a standalone piece of info. I'm going to think back to what does ELD instruction look like at my LEA? How is ELD provided to students? And how are they grouped? And this is important because typically when we are looking at building our ELD classes, we look at the overall LPAC and we group based on that, which brings us to this next piece. We want to remind you that the overall score may not reflect the student's needs per domain. See that little insert there? 3 overall, moderately developed. When we look closely at the second page, we see that those domains don't necessarily match up. Earlier, I talked to you in this graphic about how the oral language composite is both speaking and listening, and the written language composite includes both writing and reading. Here we see it in the report. There is the oral language composite right up here at the top blue arrow. The composite for oral language is a 3, and it includes listening and speaking. Looking at it more closely though, I see that at listening, this student is at the well-developed stage. Whereas when I look at speaking, they're somewhat moderately developed. There's a slight difference there. However, when I put those two together, the student generated an overall, an oral language composite of 3, which then feeds into the overall for the LPAC of 3. Then I look at the written language composite, bottom blue arrow. And I see that for the reading domain, this student is well developed. However, looking closely at the writing domain, I see that they are at beginning to develop. When I'm planning for exchange, I'm sending this student with my level 3s. Though if we're looking at specific domains, he would need intervention or support in what? Writing. So having this information with you when you're having these meetings are going to feed into the conversation, because if the concern was that the student isn't making progress in writing or is failing writing assignments, this may not be the only answer, but it's definitely a piece to the puzzle, right? I see. They're having an issue with the writing domain. Let me go back to that ELD class and see what ELD instruction looks like in relation to writing, right? Or another conversation to be had within the context of the pre-referral conversation. Let's take a look at designated supports in the LPAC. This student doesn't have a disability, so they can't use an accommodation, but let's see if there are designated supports there that I can match up with the student's needs. As a matter of fact, let's try some out during our IABs. So again, one sheet of paper, the student score report that gives you multiple entry points to conversations around language development and provision of comprehensive ELD. So I want to give you a couple of seconds to think about some thoughts that are surfacing and share out using the Zoom friends, the Zoom chat. And for my friends here in person, have a conversation with the folks around you about what are some thoughts that are bubbling up as we're looking at this. What are some thoughts, what are some wonderings that have come to the surface looking at the score report in the context of a pre-referral conversation?
There's some wonderings of what that grouping might look like for their site. They're not sure if they're grouped necessarily towards this, as we were mentioning, per levels, but there's some wonderings on that.
Yeah, and I think that varies from site also, right? Like, how is it that students are grouped for ELD, right? It might be that maybe there aren't enough, because darn it, sometimes those kids don't come in perfect groups of 30, right? So sometimes you end up with 3s and 2s together, or 1s and 2s, and there are things that we have no control over, so absolutely that has an impact. Yes, Jessica, something else.
Another wondering that came up, and I completely agree with this from coming from a special education background, is the need to help the practitioners, the teachers, to be able to read what these LPAC scores mean. Just, that a special education teacher that doesn't have that EL background or understanding what an LPAC score, they can't make recommendations based off of it they don't know.
For sure. And again, that highlights the importance of that multidisciplinary team approach and engaging in that collective commitment to build collective expertise, because again, honestly speaking, my experience when I was receiving PD in my day back in the classroom, very much SPED teachers get SPED PD, Gen Ed teachers get Gen Ed PD, EL teachers get EL PD, and seldom times did those lanes cross, right? And I know that having come to the SELPA and working with Lupita as long as I've had, I learned so much from her about the ELD side of things, language development, language proficiency, English learner typologies, implementation of the standards, so on and so forth, that I did not have access to before. So I absolutely agree that there needs to be a space where we can learn these things that unfortunately have remained silos that do in fact have a direct impact on how we serve our students.
Just one comment, someone did their first domain exemption yesterday, but using this information, looking at past LPAC assessments, so not just one, looking at over the progress over time and looking at those strengths as well as challenges. So
for sure.
That's exciting.
That is exciting. And that's part of the conversation, right? When we're having these pre-referral meetings and even IEP meetings, once the student is already identified, how it is that we can use multiple data points to support students to be able to have as much access as possible. Because underlying this whole conversation is the whole notion of equity, right? Because we know that when we are looking at issues of disproportionate identification of English learners as students with disabilities, some of that may have been uncovered by having some more of these in-depth conversations around what's available. So something that's come up also in the past is that these reports are no longer found inside the CUME files. So before, it used to be practice that they were printed out and then they would be inserted into the CUME files. But I know some folks have shared that they're not necessarily available paper copy anymore, but you can access them online. Or they reach out to their EL coordinator, and their EL coordinator will give them access to the score report that they need. But if you're a SPED friend and you are developing that IEP, even for the IEP, this is incredibly helpful so that you can enter information in the language development portion of the present levels of performance, and for it to give you baseline data for your goals and objectives to have them truly be linguistically appropriate. Which brings us to linguistic supports. So this is, I sigh and I smile because it's a nuanced conversation, but it needs to be had. What do I mean? Well, we know that the LPAC report indicated that the student might need substantial supports, moderate supports, light supports. What does that look like? What is substantial? What is moderate? What is light? Well, we have a brief write-up of what they could be. So here, if we're looking at substantial supports, that means that the student is going to need some pretty hefty, like, layers of supports to be able to access. So here, students tend to rely on learned words and phrases that they need to communicate meaning at a very basic level, right? They might need substantial to moderate linguistic supports for familiar social situations and academic contexts, but are going to need substantial linguistic supports to communicate on less familiar topics. And it aligns with the emerging proficiency level. So think of our students who speak in very simple sentences, you know, like, or when you have them write a sentence, I like school, or I like the cat is this, you know, very short, concise, basic language portions. Whereas a student who is more at the moderate level, and know that here we're talking about students who are neurotypical, who are developing language normally, quote unquote, whatever normally means. And then we're looking at moderate linguistic supports. Moderate linguistic supports captures a broad range of English learners. Here are, we find students who can meet immediate communication skills and can communicate in meaningful ways in a range of topics and content areas, however, are going to need varied degrees of linguistic supports depending on task and purpose. And they're going to need substantial to moderate supports to communicate on less familiar topics. And it really aligns to that expanding proficiency level. Then we have light linguistic supports. So light linguistic supports are just that. They can use English to learn and communicate in meaningful ways that are appropriate to tasks, purpose, audience. They might need occasional linguistic supports to engage in familiar social academic contexts, and light support to communicate on less familiar tasks. And this typically aligns with students at that bridging level. Super surface level, because this is looking at linguistic supports generally. Now, I want us to think about this by domain. For some of our students, it might be that for listening, they require light linguistic supports. However, when it comes to reading, they're going to need moderate supports. But when it comes to writing, they're going to need substantial supports. Think of this student right here, writing 1. So this helps us start thinking of that learner variability, including language. And if we're looking at this by domain, even more so. What might that look like? So let's spend some time thinking about linguistic supports by domain. Knowing that we may be sitting at that pre-referral meeting, that SST, MTSS meeting, and we are looking at scores, having these conversations that we've been having, and we recognize that the student may need more supports in one domain than in another. In-person friends, spend some time talking to your table partners as to what are some linguistic supports that you might provide by domain and how you might up the level of support or diminish it depending on the need. Zoom friends, the same. What do I mean by that? Well, sentence frames. I'm going to use sentence frames for writing or speaking. I could use them for both. Speaking, the student is more proficient, so they're not going to need super detailed or very basic sentence frames. Whereas for writing, I'm going to need more substantial sentence frames to support them in the writing. So spend a couple of minutes having that conversation, and we'll be back in about 2 minutes. All right, some lively conversation happening. So what are some of the comments that came up? What are some linguistic supports that we might provide students per domain? And what happens when a student may need more supports in one domain than in another? Any comments? Yes.
This made me think of what I struggle the most with is the writing domain. So I can come up with a lot of strategies for the other ones. Some of the same ones also fit writing.
Right.
But then it made me also think about part 2 of the ELD standards, which is the how English works.
Mm-hmm.
And the structure of just sentences.
For sure.
And what kind of strategies would fit alongside that.
For sure. And I think that's such a critical point because, so I don't know how familiar Zoom friends and friends here in person are with the ELD standards, but the ELD standards are divided into 3 parts, right? Part 1 is communicating in meaningful ways. Part 2 is learning about how English works. And part 3 is the foundational skills, which are the same standards as your K-5 ELA foundational skill standards. Reading, fluency, phonics, decoding, etc. Part 1 is, I think, is where most practitioners feel comfortable in. And that's where kids, quote unquote, trick us. Because we hear them interacting, whether it be by collaborating, producing, however it is that they're interacting in meaningful ways, we think they've got it. They're speaking in English, they can engage. However, it's in later years that we notice that they get stuck at that emerging level, that expanding level, I'm sorry. They get stuck there. Why does that happen? Well, because they are not perhaps receiving the consistent instruction about learning how English works. It's important for us to recognize that you can't teach part 1 of the standards, of the ELD standards in isolation. It doesn't happen. You need to be doing both. You need to be doing both. And a way for me to highlight that for you in a way that makes sense is exactly what was shared earlier. When we're looking at part 2 of the standards, we're talking about learning about how English works. And we start talking about like structures for like comparison, compare and contrast, right? That is a very specific type of sentence frame that you would use to teach that for a student. For some students, you would have to perhaps couple it with a graphic organizer and that sentence frame. That's more of a substantial support than the light level of support a student might need who might only need a word bank with compare contrast words. So very different types of levels of linguistic support for a variety of tasks depending on domain needs. Thank you for sharing that. Very insightful. Anything else, Jessica?
Just kind of sharing again that making sure we explore all those universal tools and per domain. So we're not just looking at and overall, you know what, they need this type of support. We're really looking at what those students' needs and going back to those LPAC scores.
And I love that, especially for my friends here who participate often in these pre-referral meetings. Use the accessibility resources matrix as a tool during these meetings, because remember that for students who have not been identified as having a disability or having an active IEP or a 504 plan, you can access any and all of the universal tools and the designated supports. So when you're having these conversations that are domain specific, take a look at that matrix. The matrix can be helpful once you've hit that proverbial brick wall and you're like, I can't even think of anything else to offer. Refer to the matrix. Not that it's going to be inclusive of every single thing available under the sun, but it'll give you a starting point to start having these conversations. Great point. Thank you for sharing, Zoom friends. And well, here's just a quick example in case you were drawing a blank, right? So what might some linguistic supports look like? Well, depending on the student, we may be using manipulatives, depending on the task as well, depending on the purpose too. Interactive word walls, real objects, pictures, graphics, cooperative learning, building background knowledge, reading aloud interactively, using labels, technology. Any type of support that takes into consideration where the student is in their language acquisition journey that matches where they are is a linguistic support, so long as the student will have time to access it. So we spent some time talking about the MTSS framework, specifically the tiers of instruction and intervention. We also talked about ELD, the LPAC, a little bit about the ELD standards, and I recognize that that's a lot of information. It's a lot of information to retain, and it's a lot of information to share if you're joining us today with that task, right, of gathering resources and sharing. So to give you some time to review and reflect, yes, the slide says team time, but sometimes we're a team of one, and that's okay. I've linked in 3 infographics. One, the first one is Tier 1 instruction, gives you some salient points about Tier 1 instruction and links you back to the practitioner's guide to give you more information on Tier 1. That second infographic that you see there is for Tier 2 interventions. And that third one there is Tier 3. Off to the side, you see a note-taking guide. By clicking on that, it'll prompt you to make a copy. Click on the image, and it'll give you some reflection talking points and some spaces for you to collect some notes and information. However, I'm noticing that some of you are not having access, and we'll do that right now briefly. However, what we're going to spend some time right now while we make sure that the other links are active is I want you to click on that middle graphic. It's going to take you to, yes, this is a real site, do not be frightened, flippity.net. So click on it, and it should open a Venn diagram. Once you pop open that Venn, you're going to see that you have 3 colored labels. One says integrated ELD, one says designated ELD, and the other one says both. I want you to take the one that says both and stick it right in the middle where the 2 circles overlap. Integrated on one side and designated on the other. We are going to use this digital manipulative to help you organize and understand what some of the similarities and what some of the differences are between integrated ELD, designated ELD, and which are characteristics of both. So I'm going to give you some time to play with that Venn, because the value isn't necessarily in the completion of the Venn appropriately, but in the conversation we're going to have around it. So I'm going to set 7 minutes on my timer. I'll check back in with you at 11:15 and we'll have a conversation about integrated ELD and designated ELD. See you in a few. How did we, number one, enjoy this activity? Was it a good one? Was it frustrating? Were you almost coming to fisticuffs with your partners, deciding what went where? Exactly, which is why I mentioned earlier that, so this activity was born out of the belief modules, part of CISESA's, I believe it's the steering committee. And so we adapted it to use it for our trainings because we really felt that there was so much room for conversation around what those quote unquote requirements are for designated ELD, or those characteristics of comprehensive ELDR, and where there are opportunities for overlap, and really helping us not necessarily just know what's right or what's wrong, but inform our practice and thinking about how it is that we serve students who are English learners who might potentially be having difficulty accessing academic content that may be related to language needs that may not be necessarily addressed by consistent quality ELD instruction, right? That's the $1,000,000 conversation. So hopefully the link is working for all of you for the note-taking guide. Know that it's going to make a forced copy, and this note-taking guide is just one that we've developed locally for our needs. However, feel free to take that document and make it your own. Like I mentioned earlier, every resource that we share with you today is for you to take and use as it best fits your practice and responsibilities. Same thing with that Flippity. If you think it's a worthwhile activity to engage with staff, take that link, share it out. It's available online. Use it, make some different ones. If you make a really cool one, share it my way. I love always learning from all of you out there. So to bring it all together now, we talked about various elements of what the student profile may look like, from data points to data sources to monitoring to English language proficiency to the levels of linguistic supports that correspond with language domains. And that is going to help us interpret what intervention summary data looks like. Why? Because instruction and intervention summary data should be based on clearly defined and consistently implemented Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 instructions and interventions that also take into account where the student is at their language journey. Think of a 5th grade student who's a new arrival and is not making progress in writing in his classroom, noticing the English learner typology that the student most closely aligns with is a new arrival with limited schooling. That would explain a lot. How would I know that? Digging into the QUME. If I wouldn't find that information there, would I know where to start? Probably not. But knowing well ahead of time that I may need to make connections and invite different individuals to these meetings to ensure that if moving forward, we're making an appropriate referral. And I come back to the term appropriate referral because child find is a responsibility. If there is a suspected disability, we must assess. If the disability is so evident that that is your first thought, assess. However, if you can't say that quality and comprehensive ELD has been provided to this student consistently as our system's responsibility as Tier 1 first best instruction, how can we say we suspect a disability? Because the disability is going to be present in that primary language too. It's not going to show only in English. If a disability is present, it exists across languages and across contexts. So we oftentimes have, the feedback of like, well, so are you saying don't assess for SPED? No, that's not what we're saying. We're saying if there's a need, you assess. You know when there's a need. But if you are sitting in a position where you can't say for sure that this student has been receiving the necessary Tier 1 first core best instruction and has had access to Tier 2 interventions, Tier 3 interventions, and we're attempting to support them by giving them SPED, you heard Dr. Alba Ortiz. A lot of our kids, once they get in, they don't get out. So know that when this is happening, we need to look inward at the system, how it is that we are serving our students. Which takes us to the following. When we're looking to group students, let's say we have students who are struggling and we've established that this student is at the emerging level. Is it advisable for us to group English learners with non-English learners for RTI? Yes or no? What do we think? Thumbs up? Thumbs down? Don't know? Sideways? Is it advisable to group them together? Yes, absolutely. 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 English learners may benefit from being grouped with non-English speakers or non-English learners with English-speaking peers with similar learning needs. And that's the key, right? Remember that we talked about identifying the specific area of need? Once we've pinpointed those similar learning needs, we can group them. However, it is important to remember that English learners should be monitored separately than their English-only peers. So like to like, right? To determine if appropriate levels of progress are being made, taking into consideration the English language proficiency of the student when grouping for instruction. What does that mean? Let's take it apart. So if we're grouping for RTI and we have an English-only set of students, let's say we have in fictional Funland, we have a group of 20 students. And we have 10 students who are English only and 10 students who are English learners, and they're grouped in this intervention together. So when I'm going to progress monitor, yes, I'm looking at the whole class, but when I'm establishing if the intervention is grouping, I want to compare like to like. What does that mean? Well, I'm not going to compare to English-only peers. I'm going to compare to the progress that their English learner peers are making. Additionally, I want to do that with a grain of salt. I want to note out of my 10 English learners, how many are at the emerging level, how many of them are at the expanding, and how many are at the bridging, because the growth may be different depending on where they are. Additionally, I would want to look at that by domain. As you remember earlier, when we saw how they were a 3, a 2, and a 1 in different areas, we want to take a look at that also, not as a means of including or excluding, but as a means of building our understanding of where the student is. Because again, we want to exhaust all opportunities to make progress in Tier 1 core instruction. And that goes back to those UDL content slides that we saw briefly, where we're establishing evidence-based practices that are inclusive of all students, including behavioral and social emotional needs. We're also ensuring that our environment is inclusive, equitable, and integrated. Again, those UDL principles that we are continuing to provide both integrated and designated ELD, that there is comprehensive assessments that is continuously informing our practice. Because if we're doing all of these, we should see around 80% of our students achieve success within Tier 1 supports with differentiation. That's your Tier 1. Again, UDL to ensuring that we are adjusting to unanticipated needs, designing for our students at the margins, designing accessible work, and creating experimental learning groups for learning opportunities, because it is during this Tier 1 first best instruction that we are planning with learner variability in mind. What does that mean? That there's no such thing as average, that all of us have a jagged learner profile, that we have different needs and variability in relation to interest, effort and resilience, emotional well-being, how we perceive content, the language we use, the background knowledge we bring in, our physical navigation skills, our communication skills, and our own executive functioning skills. Think of yourself sitting here since 8:30 or at home in front of your computer or at work in front of your computer. What are ways that you are using to help you maintain interest? I know it's not just our beautiful voices. You're doing things for yourself to maintain interest, effort and resilience to push through and pay attention and stay engaged, and ensuring that you're well regulated. How are we doing that as we're sitting in our seats? Some of us are snacking, some of us are fidgeting, some of us are taking needed trips to the bathroom, some of us are taking just, I need to get out of here for a couple of second trips to the bathroom. I know that's what I do. You know, a variety of things that we do to ensure that we are remaining interested, putting forth effort, being resilient learners, and being well managed and monitored when it comes to regulation. How we perceive content. We designed this session to try to engage all of you in ways that can be helpful. So what else could we have done? We could have provided paper copies of the slides. Those of you at home, maybe you decided to print those slides as soon as the share link was put up. Some of you are using the note space in the slides to take your notes. Others are writing on a different sheet of paper. Some of you are doodling on a separate sheet of paper to remain focused. Some of you are making annotations. Some of you know that you're going to wait for the recording to come back out so you can review the sections that you wanted to remember appropriately. Some of you are connecting to some of the content that we're sharing based on your background knowledge. You're observing and identifying actionable next steps from your sphere of influence. And you're thinking about how to share this information with others and how to organize it in a way that makes sense and fits within the confines of your role. The same thing happens with that Tier 1 first best instruction for our students. All of these elements that we just touched upon are part of that Tier 1 first best instruction, including differentiation prior to making referral to Tier 2 interventions. And we're going to stop here to ensure that you get out on time for lunch, because here we're going to go into the more nuanced bits of Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. I know some questions are coming up in the chat about how long, how often, so on and so forth. We'll save those conversations for after lunch. In the meantime, I'm going to let you get up, stretch, move, and absolutely take care of that hunger that I'm sure is building up inside. We will see you back in 1 hour, 12:30 sharp. See you then. Enjoy your lunch. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming back after lunch. I will do my best to help you combat that carb coma after lunch by keeping it nice and brisk and moving forward. So prior to lunch break, we talked about Tier 1 instruction. Now we're going to go into Tier 2 intervention in more detail. Even though we touched upon it briefly in the morning, today we're going to spend some time looking at some of the specifics. And if you notice off to the side on the column, it says some students. Tier 2 is only for some students. And there, and on the bulleted list, you can see some specifics. It's additional evidence-based support for some students needing more academic, behavioral, and social emotional help, and so on and so forth. You can read those bullets on your own. I won't read those for you. Know that those points made under Tier 2 are also included in that one infographic that is linked here to the side and is part of that pre-referral note-taking guide that we had shared with you. So all of the tools that we have shared with you up until this point can be found linked into that note-taking guide to support your team's discussions around Tier 1 and Tier 2 supports. So teams having this as a framework for engaging in Tier 2 intervention conversations is really helpful. Additionally, we've also linked Figure 2.11 from the Practitioner's Guide, which is a really neat resource because it tells you what Tier 2 is and what it isn't. So it does some myth busting specific to Tier 2 interventions. And if you notice there that 15%, that's just as a reminder that only around 15 to 20% of your students are going to require Tier 2 supports. But if we look at the table, it goes even further than that. Tier 2 is supplemental instruction, meaning that it's in addition to the core grade level instruction, meaning that students don't lose Tier 1. They get Tier 1 and then some. Tier 2 is not a replacement of the core curriculum. If students do not have access to the core curriculum, they're only going to fall further behind. I recognize that that poses some difficulties, especially when we think of the monster that is the master schedule in our middle schools and high schools. So that is fact. Tier 2 is focused and targeted to specific skills that are associated with broader academic successes. However, what it is not, it's not reteach time. Okay? It's not reteach time for things that the student didn't master, changing decimals to percent, identifying character traits, so it's not a reteaching opportunity. You are in fact intervening in an identified area of need that is targeted and will involve data collection. It is designed for students who are not making adequate progress on core skills. It is not for students who did not master a specific skill or content. That, in fact, that second column, that bit that I just read, is reteaching, which can be done via differentiation, small group, still part of Tier 1. Tier 2, in respect to the ELD standards, is all about explicit instruction that is aligned to those ELD standards. So if you're providing Tier 2 interventions, now it's not just teaching the standards as your focal standards, but actually digging in deep to specific standards. And again, as a reminder, it's for approximately 15% of your students at that particular grade level. And if you notice off to the side, it states what I shared with you earlier, that if more than 15%, that's probably an indication that your Tier 1 instruction may be inadequate. So again, this tool is available for you to access by clicking on this document. And this is the type of tool that I like to use when having some difficult conversations. It's always important to have a buffer of sorts when we're going to have some sometimes tricky conversations with peers, right? Tell me about your Tier 2 interventions. Oh, well, in my class for Tier 2, I do reteaching in a small group in the back. Oh, okay, so would it fall more on this column or on that column? Let's see what you just described. Oh yeah, so see, that's not a Tier 2. So we can have those difficult conversations by using a resource to anchor and center that moment of discomfort that can come from having these necessary, yet again, as I mentioned, potentially uncomfortable conversations. And then as we keep moving through the tiers, having already spent some time looking at Tier 1 for first best instruction, then looking at Tier 3, Tier 2, now we arrive at Tier 3, which is intensive with individualized supports. Whereas Tier 2 was targeted with supplemental supports, Tier 3 is intensive with individualized supports. Tier 3 is for few students. Tier 3 is targeted and intensive, not just in academic, but in behavioral and social emotional. The support is individualized to meet specific student needs based on assessments, not feelings, but assessments. Progress monitoring occurs more frequently than in Tier 1 and Tier 2 so that we can make sure that we are having maximum acceleration of student progress. And inclusive of English learners, all interventions include integrated ELD. What does that mean? Is this a separate intervention? No. Meaning that you're using the ELD standards to support the implementation of that intervention. If more than 5% of your students are involved in Tier 3, we may need to engage in deeper conversations around Tier 1 and Tier 2 level systematic problem solving to improve services. So if your pyramid is looking upside down where it's more Tier 2, Tier 3 heavy than Tier 1, then we should really engage in some inward looking conversations and outward looking conversations, right? Because at the end of the day, we are all part of the system and we all have a sphere of influence, and it's up for us to establish where those connective points are within the cogs in the system to ensure that it's running smoothly and equitably. So, that's a bit blurry, or maybe it's just my eyesight. But figure 2.12 does a great job at helping us visualize the difference between Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports. So earlier I talked about the importance of collecting an index of interventions available at your site, because sometimes it might change from classroom to classroom, from content area to content area, and part of establishing a system includes having clear, concrete access to interventions at the Tier 2 level and at the Tier 3 level. Not only that, but we also have to recognize specific characteristics of each of the tiers. So if we're looking at organizational factors, Tier 2, we're looking at a time slot of about 30 minutes per day for 3 to 5 days a week. So that's about the time frequency you're looking at for a Tier 2 intervention. For a Tier 3, 45 to 120 minutes, possibly 5 days a week. So again, earlier I mentioned the master schedule conundrum, right? The fact that we only have so many instructional minutes a day, and the fact that none of us as individuals can resolve these issues involve a systems-wide conversation that cannot be fixed or solved in 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. It may take a lot of planning. However, having the necessary information and having these conversations is absolutely a step forward. Now let's look at those assessment factors. We keep talking about diagnostic assessment and collecting assessment data. When we're looking at Tier 2, we are looking at group diagnostic assessments, and at times, for certain students, depending on need, it may be individualized. So you're not necessarily giving it to the entire class, but only to a specific group to determine an area of need. Whereas Tier 3 is individualized diagnostic assessment. Think back to, so I date myself here, where we were using results consistently in the classroom. And we were doing the results assessment to establish where the student was. We were also using dibbles. We were using different types of assessment And again, it all depends on what you have access to locally within your LEA to be able to fully inform this process. And then finally, when we're looking at instructional factors, we're looking at all of the things here to the side. We're looking at our OTRs, which are opportunities to respond, right? So student responding. Instructional focus, behavioral expectations, review and repetitions, error correction, and scaffolding. So if you notice there on opportunities to respond, we're wanting to ensure at the tier 2 level that students are having at least 6 to 8 opportunities to respond a minute, right? Tier 3, 8 to 12. So very far removed from sage on the stage model of delivery, right? We're wanting that interaction. Why? Because that's absolutely going to provide the amount of review and repetitions and opportunities to error correct. So it's all connected. The more often we're having students participate, the better it is for us to do some level of diagnostic, on the fly, formative, informal, all of the types of assessment that we could do by having that increase in student response. One of the things that I do want to call out here, because it's important, is that sometimes we have access to these very shiny, very bright, very beautiful, prepackaged, computer-based interventions. And if we're looking at opportunities to respond, yes, you might be having students type on the keyboard, say something into the microphone, but that immediate feedback that is specific or corrective if necessary in nature is not 100% there. And we also have to remember that in addressing learner variability, we also have to consider the student's preferred learning modality as well. So one intervention program may not be the best one for all students across the board. And I think we all know that as educators. In error correction, tier 2 level, we're actually prompting students to correct errors themselves, and we're guiding them in that process. Whereas at the tier 3 level, you are providing direct error correction for the students. So the best example I can give you is when I was in the classroom, one of the programs that I used was SRA corrective reading. So SRA corrective reading was very much a tier 3 intervention. I remember I was trained in the program. I used a clicker for the student response. And then I had a projector. Yes, I taught in the age of projectors with my vis-a-vis, drawing my markers and my overhead projector sheets. And I would write out the letter sounds and the words. And some of you who are of my generation might remember, if you taught SRA, that it was like the word and then like a little dot and then the arrow, and then you would start at the sound and then move it across. So it would sound something like this. This letter is ah. What sound? Click. What sound? Yes, ah. This letter is d. What sound? What sound? Good. This letter is f. What sound? F. What sound? Good. This letter is mm. What sound? What sound? Good. Let's put some of those words together. This word says Sam. Say it with me. Sam. Say it fast. Sam. What word? Sam. That is very much a tier 3. So that's just to give you an example of what opportunities to respond, because I'm giving instruction to the whole group. They're all responding, and it's a small enough group that I can hear what they're saying and provide corrective feedback, so that if I say, this sound is and the student says I'll say, okay, let's try again. The sound is What sound? What sound? Everybody, what sound? That's right. What sound? And you're giving that feedback and opportunities to respond consistently. Ooh, that took me back. I almost imagined my kiddos in front of me. Now I'm a little sad. So when you're thinking about your interventions that you're providing, it's all about how you're documenting and keeping track of all of this information so that we can make appropriate recommendations. So speaking of recommendations, let's do a little pop quiz here. Don't worry, no grades. Yes or no? Is there a recommended or required amount of time an English learner must be in MTSS or RTI before making a referral for special education? I've seen that question in the chat and in the Q&A a few times. So let's see. Here's your chance. Brave space. Yes, there's a recommended time. No, there isn't. Sideways, I don't know, or I have issues with commitment. Survey says no and yes. In other words, it depends, right? It depends. So it is best practice or recommended for English learners to receive, here's the caveat, high quality, evidence-based interventions over a 4 to 6 month period. Recommended. In order to provide enough time to determine, or at least help us make a clearer determination, if the student is struggling academically due to a disability or a language difference, and if the student's academic difficulties can be remediated in general education. It is best to start progress monitoring after 4 weeks. Because if you start the program on Monday and by Friday you're saying the program doesn't work, that's not ample time. If you're not coupling introducing the program with procedures and expectations and organization, it's not going to work. So there's many variables that are not necessarily intervention dependent that factor into this response. So, answer again in a nutshell, it depends. That being said, here's another one. Can LEAs establish policies and procedures that delineate that English learners must have received a certain number of years of English language development prior to a referral for assessment to determine eligibility for special education? In my district, you can't refer till you've been receiving ELD for 5 years. In my district, you can't refer until you have 7 years of ELD instruction. In my district, it's 3. May a district establish a certain number of years that ELD is required prior to referral? Answer is no. Yeah, no. Federal and state law require all children with disabilities residing in the state who are in need of special education and related services be identified, located, and assessed. So again, here's that child find requirement, right? If we suspect a disability, a true disability that is not due to limited schooling, that is not due to attendance, that is not due to inadequate ELD instruction, that is not due to a myriad other extrinsic factors, we must assess and determine if the student is eligible, because we know that the research supports early intervention for students to make adequate progress. So you guys get a break from me. You've been listening to me talk for a long, long time, and now it's time for me to pass it over to Jessica so she can walk us through the tool, meaning that she's going to put all of the things we talked about together into a two-pager? A front and back two-pager that'll help you keep all of the resources together. There you go. Sure, yeah.
All right, so like she mentioned, we are gonna be looking at a tool that through Project Muse that we made to kind of help guide multidisciplinary teams go through the process of looking at different factors that really could be impacting our students' progress and making sure that we're making those appropriate referrals to assessment for potential eligibility in special education. Okay? And so it really is trying to find and to create that comprehensive picture and seeing the whole child and the needs that they have and the different backgrounds that they come from due to culture factors, language factors, the environment around them. So we'll go ahead and get started on that. The 4 key factors, or we call them considerations, are the extrinsic factors, personal and cultural factors, language development, and learning environments. Okay. Within the slide, if you click on the graphic, it should pop up the infographic, and within there, there's different embedded resources. I checked them earlier, so they should be working, but if you find one that's not, just let us know. All right, so we'll go ahead and jump right in. And again, this is intended as a tool to be used kind of as a guide to go through that process of looking at data that already ideally will exist or things that we need to look and find and see what's happening with the student. It's not saying that this is the way to do it. It's not intended to be a checklist. You know, we checked this, we checked that, we did what we needed to do, but more of just a guide to really do that deeper dive. So the first consideration is intrinsic factors. We know our students come in, they're very unique, they have their own needs, they coming from a specific environment that might impact them in certain ways, and we really want to make sure that we have the opportunity to look at and see what those students are bringing to the table. So earlier we talked about that in-depth cumulative file review, and like Vanessa said earlier, it can be a little overwhelming, right? There's a lot of information, especially if they've been enrolled in school for a long period of time. They might be very, very thick, or in some cases it might be very thin if they don't have a lot of information. So we do have a resource here, the Appendix 3.2. It comes from the California Practitioner's Guide, and again, it's a tool that can help guide that data review, right? That in-depth cumulative review to really take a look at that demographic information, attendance, anything else that might be occurring, assessment results, maybe any behavioral issues that have been present, or health history. So we'll take a look as we go through. I'll pull up the resources and we'll kind of go through them. The nice thing about these is that you can download them, you can edit them, you can share them, you can print them, and really it's not saying that you have to use this form, but more of, have you considered these questions, or have you considered those areas? If you have something that does that already, then that's great. If not, maybe there's some things on here that you can add to your process. So we'll kind of take a look at it. And as you can see at the top, and you'll find that very often when we're looking at these files, is that it starts off with that very general demographic information. Okay, this one takes a look at the LPAC scores, and again, making sure we're looking at it. If we're doing the OG LPAC, the summative LPAC, we're looking at domains, how they're doing in individual domains. We're also looking at the cumulative file at, is it even present? Is it at the school district? Do we have that information? Is there already an IEP in existence, or did the student have an IEP prior but was exited from special education services? Has the student gone through SST process before? Are there any hearing problems or vision problems that might be present? How about attendance? Okay. What about fine motor or gross motor concerns? Speech and language, ELD instruction. Has a student been receiving consistent ELD instruction over what period of time? And then just as a reminder, it seems like maybe we're having a little bit of a hard time getting on that. If you go to the slide before and click on the flow chart, right where it says what does it say? Conduct an in-depth file review. Right below, there's a little tool, a little wrench. You're going to click on there where it's green and it says Appendix. I didn't describe that. Appendix 3.2, and it'll be right there. All right. So again, you're just going to go through this and look into cumulative file and see if you can find those things. If you can't, who do you reach out to find more information? You also want to make sure that we're looking at what are some of the student strengths that we find when we're looking at the cumulative file. Are they consistently present at school? Are they, do they have excellent hearing or vision? What are those things that stand out as strengths? And then you also want to make sure that you're adding any comments on the bottom, right? Anything that's related to that, something that you might find interesting, or maybe that's something that's impacting the student's progress. The other extrinsic factor that we can look at is any pre-existing social, emotional, mental health, or psychological factors, as well as the physical or health conditions that might be present. And then we can utilize the Appendix 3.3. So again, you can find that right underneath that section. It has a little toolbox. And we know that our students that are English learners, well, some of them tend to move, right? And there's things that come along with that. Maybe it could be trauma, or maybe they have difficulty with assimilation, or difficulties with the change that can lead to behavioral problems, or even depression, anger, and all those things. And this is part of that we're looking at. The other thing that we have mentioned below is the physical and health conditions. Again, are they receiving the resources that they need in order to maintain their health? And our Appendix 3.3 kind of guides us through that, the Part A, Section A. Again, at the top, you start with your demographic information. That little paragraph kind of describes a little bit what you're looking at and what might impact the student's needs. And the next part kind of gives us some guiding questions. If you click on the actual words itself. So we were having a little bit of just trying to find the appendix. If you go to the resource, and that's okay, open the resource. Awesome. All right. So, perfect. So Appendix 3.3, again, it is an editable form. You can download it, you can share it, you can save it, all that good stuff. And again, it just gives us some guiding questions of what to look for. And I'm going to go ahead and go to this side so I can read. One of the questions is, does the student have access to health care? Are the student's basic nutritional needs being met? Do we know this? Do we not know it? Is it something we need to look further into? And who can we ask? Right? Are the vision and hearing within normal ranges? Does the student come to school and it appears that they're constantly having ear infections, or that they have some maybe dental issues that aren't being taken care of? And I know myself, and I know probably a lot of people feel this way, if your basic needs aren't being taken care of, it's going to impact how you're doing, right? If I was hungry right now, I probably would be very distracted. If I didn't get my coffee this morning, things like that. So we want to make sure that we're looking and making sure that those basic needs are being met. And again, looking, because we're not just looking at what areas need improvement, we want to know what strengths there are. Maybe the student's basic needs are being met. We've found out that, they're coming to school every morning, they're having a big breakfast, they're getting provided lunch. We want to make sure that we're noting that so we can rule it out. And again, if you find areas for intervention, so something that calls out, like in the student looks like they have major dental maybe issues, but that aren't being taken care of, that's something we want to note on there as well. So when we're looking at our extrinsic factors, we're going through, we did our cumulative file, we find attendance is an issue, or we're going through and we're finding out that, the student has some, trauma based on things that have happened in their life. What do we do then, right? What do we do with that information that we find? So go ahead and take a minute to think about it. If we, as a team, we're going through this process and we find, there's other issues that might be happening that are affecting their academic or behavior, What do we do? Go ahead and take a minute to think about it. Do we continue to go through the process of referring into special education? What are you guys' thoughts? You get to this point and you're looking and you find that your student has some areas that need some intervention. What do you do at that point? What do you guys think? Anyone want to share? Thumbs up. Do we keep going forward with the referral to special education, or thumbs down? There might other be the factors, right, that we say, you know what, they still might have a potential disability. There might be that where we continue. But most likely at this point, we're going to want to stop and say, hey, what other interventions might be present before we go to special education? If a student is exhibiting tardiness and they're not making progress, does that automatically call for special education to work in that area? Not necessarily. Right? Maybe you need to connect them with the counselor. If a student is having has a health condition and it's not being taken care of, who can we reach out to? So school nurse, right? And maybe they can reach out to any kind of referrals or anything like that. So trying to find out ways to support those needs and see if that we can improve their either academic or behavioral challenges. The next piece is the personal and cultural factors. And it's really going back to that, making sure that we build that whole child approach, right? We know our students come with different experiences, different needs, and again, just keeping it in mind that when they come, they have these things that are maybe occurring, they're still intrinsic factors, but it could also be coming from their culture. Okay, so the first one we have here is I'm gonna come to this side so I can look. I like Vanessa. Even though I have glasses on, maybe I'm going to blame it on the font size. All right. So when we're looking at personal factors, we need to consider anything like their social economic status. What is their living situation like? Are they consistently living in one home? Are they moving frequently? What does parent involvement look like? Is that consistent? Are they receiving support? Are they moving constantly so they're in a new school frequently? Has there been any maybe potential student academic difficulties or behavior? Looking at cultural background, whether it be because of different cultural differences or cultural norms, can that impact their learning? Is language or culture a barrier to the student's progress? So really just getting more information on the student's personal and cultural factors, and then again we can refer back to Appendix 3.3. It'll be the same link as the previous one, but it's going to be a little bit further down on the page for page 2 and page 3. And this one is similar to that last one that we were looking at, where it has some guiding questions to do that deeper dive. Has a student moved schools frequently? Yes, no, do we know? Are there economic circumstances affecting achievement in school? And do we have that information? Do we have this information readily available always? Maybe not, right? So we need to do a little bit of a deeper dive. And again, acknowledging what are some of those strengths we find and what are some of those areas that needed for intervention. Maybe we find that they have a strong home environment, they're getting the parent involvement. We want to make sure that we're acknowledging that. Okay. I'm going to go back to that first one. Something that we also want to do when we're looking at that personal and cultural factors is, well, who knows more about the student's culture and those things that are happening personally than the parents? So we want to make sure that we're conducting a parent interview or questionnaire to gain more information. I'm going to go to that. And that's linked in there as well. It's the Appendix 4.2 English Learner Parent Questionnaire. And this one, again, is looking at getting more information, right? So we're going to ask a little bit about their language development over time, their language usage, language instruction. At school, a student might be coming in and rarely using language. They might come in and they're not really speaking English, or they're coming in and they're not really communicating. But at home, they might be having full-blown conversations, okay? And we might not get that full picture of what they're doing or what they're capable of because of whatever factors might be existing. So by doing this, we'll be able to kind of see what's happening in all areas. So again, when we're doing this, we went through it in the extrinsic factors, we're looking at personal and cultural. What if something arises during that time? We start noticing, you know what, they're moving frequently or whatever that might be, and we see, again, this could be leading to academic and behavioral challenges. Do we go forward and we say, yep, we're going to go ahead and go with this referral to special education, or do we kind of pump the brakes and see if there's ways that we can intervene? Kind of slower, right? We say, what other kind of resources are we going to pull in to support them? And there's this additional tool that's linked in, the California Department of Education Family Engagement Toolkit, and it kind of organizes some resources. All right. And up to this point, Vanessa, are there any other additional tools that you'd like to add? Good. Or any wonderings or noticings?
No, just receiving some consistent feedback that we want to pump the brakes, we want to slow down and do a little bit more digging, even though we know how dangerous that can be, right?
And I think the main thing about this tool is kind of opening your eyes to all those things that we see. You know, in a school, we might be seeing, you know what, this this LPAC scores keep coming back as 111. They're not really making it progress intervention, but we don't know what's happening outside of that. Especially if we're just one of those silos where we're just looking at ELs, we're receiving that data, we don't know the student. This kind of helps guide those teams into looking a little bit more and seeing what's happening around that might be impacting their progress. So the next part, or the next consideration, is that language development. And I kind of talked about that in the last factor, or the last consideration is we want to make sure that we're looking at all settings. What is that student's authentic language use? More than just that LPAC score. What does it look like when they're in the classroom? What does it look like when they're at home? What does it look like when they're in the playground or passing period? So really getting that whole, seeing what is their real language use rather than in isolation. Okay. So the first part of that is, of course, we've been talking about it a lot, but looking at their English language proficiency skills. Looking and seeing, okay, well, what does language look like in listening, reading, writing, as well as, I missed one, speaking. So you're looking at LPAC data, you're also looking at that curriculum-based assessments that are occurring, and then you also want to do a student interview. If you can have an interview with the student and get more information on how they use language and how they feel about their use of language, that'll give you another layer, a deeper look at that. So some of the questions that are used within the 4.3 that's linked are, I first learned to speak in. What is their first language? Of course, you're not going to want to just leave it at L1. You're going to specify what that language is. I feel more comfortable with speaking in. If I had to tell what I did over the weekend, would it be easier to say it in English or my primary language? If someone told me a story, what would it be easier for me to understand, my English, my primary language, or both? I like some of these on the bottom is, do you miss things the teacher says because you don't understand what was said? That tells a lot, right? The student might be appearing like they're not engaged or not interested, or maybe don't understand because they're not comprehending the topic, but rather it's because of the language difference. And that would give you a little bit more information. Okay, I'm going to go back to the flow chart and looking at the supports provided to our teacher. So when we want to make sure that we're acknowledging that sometimes it's the teacher that needs the support. I mean, I think often find that we're looking for ways to support further, okay? Has the teacher, some of the questions, guiding questions are, has the teacher received training in implementation of ELD standards? That's a good question. Has the student's teacher received training and support with the implementation of an ELD curriculum? Do we know how we're using it in the classroom? Has the teacher received training and support with the implementation of ELA and ELD framework? And one thing that I want to share right there is that I was sharing with Vanessa, when I was as a classroom teacher, I didn't necessarily go through an SST process. I was part of an extensive support needs classroom, so by the time the students came to me, they I guess in that sense is they didn't go through an SST process, unfortunately. And so coming back to these questions is, has a student teacher received training in implementing ELD? If I had the opportunity to provide input at the time, or maybe for teachers now or any teacher, it's going to often be maybe not, or maybe not enough. So it's really important that we give the opportunity to teachers or us to look at what are we providing our teachers training in. So taking a look at that. So there is an appendix 3.3. Let me make sure I'm on the right one, sorry. 3.3, but we're going to be looking at C and D. And some questions. Again, is there evidence that student has received systematic ELD instruction, both integrated and designated? We need to spend a lot of time on that, looking at that today. It's a major factor. Does a teacher use explicit oral and written language models? Are there opportunities for the students to interact and talk in the lesson? Okay. Various questions to kind of guide us through that. And then we also want to make sure we take a look at our ELD. What does designated ELD look like? What does integrated ELD look like? Is that part of our Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 instruction? And what are our students' progress? So we can use that 3.3 again to kind of guide us through those questions. The next one is multidisciplinary teams are encouraged to conduct observations. Okay? More than one. So there's a tool within the appendix as well, another beautiful tool that is intended to use as for observing a classroom for English with an English learner. And it is open-ended. It's not like our other questions where we're able to kind of make a selection, but it kind of leaves us to input information that we're observing, whether that's the environment, so what's happening in the classroom. Are there models in the classroom? Is it student-centered? Are there high expectations? Are the instruction observations, so are they clearly defined? Is there flexible grouping being used? Are they building on their background knowledge? Are they utilizing visual prompts or different accessibility resources? Are there checks for understanding? Are they being given the opportunity for active participation? So not only looking on what's available in the environment, but what does that student look like? Are they actively participating in instruction? And some options there. So again, we want to stop at this part. Think about it. If we go in and we're looking, we're like, you know what? Tier 1 instruction maybe isn't, at its strong suit, or this ELD instruction isn't really being provided. We need to, again, consider what do we need to do at this point? Do we just keep kind of moving along, or do we stop and say, okay, what kind of intervention can we provide, whether that's support to the teacher to provide ELD instruction? Is it to come in and do an observation again, make sure that there's improvement, and kind of making sure that we have those interventions in place and supporting whatever those needs might be. All right. And the fourth consideration is the learning environment. So looking at, are we providing appropriate supports to our students? Okay. Both, we're thinking academically as well as linguistically when we're thinking about our English learners. All right. So consider those accessibility resources. And I know we talked a little bit about that earlier, about making sure that our students have access to those accessibility resources when they're taking that assessment, but also thinking about what are we doing when we're providing instruction. Are we providing them with appropriate supports throughout the day as well for their, to support their linguistic needs? And so linked in there is the California Assessment Accessibility Matrix. Know that this gets updated yearly. This is something that's constantly changing. Ideally, it's continuing to improve. So that's linked in there as well. We also want to make sure that we examine classroom opportunities to build English language proficiency skills. Okay? We want to make sure that we're providing their students meaningful ways to interact. And then there's another tool in there as well. We already viewed the one about the classroom observation. And there's also our focused observation of the English learners specifically during that English instruction. Again, we're looking at that demographic, the demographic information, and looking at what is the student doing and what is the teacher doing and what is the student doing. Looking at the behavior observations, impressions, what for patterns that are occurring, about the student set, what the student is doing, and so on. And then also providing some scripts, like what is being said in the classroom, what are the students saying in the classroom, how are they using language, and how are they being supported. All right, so that's our flow chart. One of the last things that we want to end with on our flow chart is that 2 reminders. Special education assessment, we want to make sure that when we do a special education assessment, we want to make sure that we're using cultural and linguistically appropriate assessment tools. And when we're looking at comprehensive ELD, and we said this several times, so we're just making sure that it's in there, is that comprehensive ELD is a Tier 1 core instruction, core service, and that multilingual learners should have access to that. Okay. There are some additional resources on the bottom linked in. We have our California Practitioner's Guide, the ELD standards. It looks like we have a few missing down here, but we'll go ahead and get them in there in regards to the curriculum framework. All right, so we do have some additional resources that we will review, but I think, Miss Vanessa, do we have anything in the chat that we want to review, or do you want to?
I do want to call out in extrinsic factors issues related to attendance, and some of the questions and comments that are coming up is, you know, like what exactly is like the limiting factor? So for example, if a student is absent often, you know, what would the next steps be? If we're pumping the brakes, like what would we do? Would we just not move forward with a referral? What are some of the steps? So I was sharing in the chat that it really depends. You would want to have as many individuals involved in the process as possible. I know that in some places they have a community liaison, excuse me, where the community liaison goes out to the homes of where students have excessive absences or tardies to determine what the reason is behind. Is it food insecurity? Is it transportation? Is it lack of clothing? Is it safety? Is it mental health? Like, what is it? To really kick in those wraparound services, starting again with what's available at the school site, but also looking outside of the school, what's available in the community, whether it be some faith-based organizations, whether it be the food bank, Salvation Army for clothing, Goodwill for clothing and or supplies, and if necessary, you know, we hope this is not the case, but when necessary, and sometimes we know it is, CPS, right? But just aligning those resources available to provide true wraparound support for those extrinsic factors that we recognize we don't have full control over and accounting for personal and cultural factors, but just providing those tools. The other thing with attendance also that I want to highlight that oftentimes comes up is that what happens when a student's grades start being impacted by attendance. And and also, and I'm wondering if this is a discussion we can have with the folks on Zoom or here in person, you know, if that would be an appropriate referral then to determine eligibility for special education. So I don't know, yes, no, what do we think, friends in the chat? Is a GPA of 1.0 due to absences an appropriate reason to refer for special education? So we're hearing some no's. Depends why they're absent, definitely no. Someone just said for SLD consideration, attendance, 10+ absences a year, especially if over 3 years, it can become an exclusionary factor for eligibility. Now I'm going to ask a follow-up question. Do we see it happen though? That students get referred for the assessment process due to low GPA.
Definitely. We see a lot of yeses.
Yep.
And I think that's one of the things that when we're looking at the flow chart and the considerations is when that referral or that comment is being made, right, of a student needs special education services, and be able to be that other person that kind of digs in and says, well, look, let's see, attendance is, you know, pretty low, and yeah, their grades are pretty low, but why are their grades pretty low? Is it because they're missing assignments? Is it because they're maybe not performing well? What is it really? So I think that that's kind of how those conversations can be held. It needs to be more than just students not coming to school.
There's a follow-up comment, which I think is amazing, and it says, one would think that the grades are based on standards, and thus, then absences are irrelevant, right? Because it's standards-based and all of that good stuff, right? However, a comment can be made that the grades are based less on instruction because on absence, right? So that's a really interesting viewpoint. And another one also is that, well, those grades, right? An A in my ELA classroom might not be an A in Bobby's ELA classroom or in Anna's ELA classroom. I may have my student notebook weighed more heavily at 40% than maybe Bobby has it at 20%, or no grades for the notebook. And at one point, are those grades really indicative of the student's ability and more teacher preference, right? What we would like to see happening in the classroom. And we see that often also when we're talking about students, who are having a hard time in a particular class where the grades have nothing to do with the student's ability or instructional content. And again, how do we remediate that and not have grades be a determinant factor as to who gets referred and who doesn't?
Yeah. So not looking at those grades over time, going through the cumulative file check and looking at their report cards, but also coupled with maybe, okay, we notice they're consistently having, I don't know, a difficult time in a certain classroom or whatever it may be, or this year they're really struggling, but last year they were doing pretty well, and looking at coupling in maybe those observations and the student interviews and seeing what those areas are, we can kind of look a little deeper and see what's going on. Any other comments? Or anything anyone wants to add?
Just really good comments and feedback in general.
Great. All right. So before we go to the next, where we're going to look at some additional resources, I think it's a good time to take a little break. Sound good? All right. So we'll go ahead and take a little break. We'll come back at 1:30. We just turned to 1:26, so 1:36. All right. Enjoy your break, and we'll see you soon. Alrighty, we're gonna go ahead and get started again. Hope you guys had a good break. Everyone got some, hopefully, coffee or some type of caffeine. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and look again. I want to give you guys an opportunity. I really flew through that pre-referral flow chart, and there's quite a bit of information on that. So I wanted to give you guys some processing time to look again at the flow chart, to look at those different considerations, being that extrinsic factors, the personal and cultural factors, the language development, and the learning environment. And kind of go through that resource again and look and see like what is an area that you feel your LEA or school site or wherever it might be might need some improvement. Is it, you know what, we really don't do a lot of work or do a lot of deep diving in the intrinsic factors. We don't really look at our students' personal and cultural factors. We don't really reach out to the parents to see what's happening at home. Whatever it might be, we want to give you a few minutes to go through and look at the different considerations and identify what is that one consideration that you feel like maybe your is an area of improvement within the system. And also what tool in there is something that you would want to go ahead and take back and implement right away or start modifying to fit your school site's needs. All right, so we're going to give you guys a couple minutes. We'll say about 5 minutes so that you can do a little, either if you're in a team, you can work together. If you're individual, that's okay as well. You're going to bring back these beautiful resources back to your team. Just go ahead and take a few minutes, 5 minutes. We'll do it up to, what is it? Let's go to 1:45. Look at the considerations, look at the different resources, and find which ones would be something that you want to take back to improve your system. All right? We'll be back in a few. All right. So thinking about the flow chart, what we've talked about today, the different considerations that are presented here, as well as the different resource. Just want to ask a couple questions and thoughts. So share out in the chat or in person. What are those considerations or those areas that we feel as a team or within your LEA or school site that is maybe the area that needs to be improved, right? We're not really looking into as much as we should be. What are your guys' thoughts? Is it the extrinsic factors? Is it the personal and cultural factors? Are we not doing so well with our language development or learning environment?
I think it's, well, I'm going to say all of them, only because I think we've reached just a surface level on all of them. And I think it's, this opens my eyes to, okay, we need to go a little bit deeper.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, so with that, like if it's just that one person too, or one area, one field that's looking at these different factors, we're not going to see as much. So again, it just thinking about it as a multidisciplinary team coming in with all those lenses and being able to pull back together. I think there's some good findings there.
In the chat, we also have personal and cultural factors, and I think that this also is a good space to bring up how might we build our multidisciplinary team based on the types of concerns that we're seeing, right? So if we're consistently seeing students who are English learners being referred, perhaps having your EL specialist, your ELD teacher, your EL TOSA there to help us dig deeper, because sometimes we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what to ask. We don't know what to look for. We don't know what data to collect. So having that level of conversation where we perhaps say, well, we can come back at a second date after we have all the relevant information before we go ahead and document this as like we tried an intervention and we don't have the appropriate information.
Yes, definitely. So not just that one first meeting and done, right? We're coming in, we're looking at what data we found, and also looking for what we don't have. And then if there's any interventions needed, try them out and come back and talk again. Any other thoughts? All right. And are there any resources or appendices or anything that's hyperlinked into that infographic that you might find that'd be useful to bring into your school site or LEA? Anything that stands out? I had one person share the cumulative file review was pretty useful. Looking through and really identifying what am I supposed to look at. I know if I were asked a year ago to sit down and look at the cum file, I'd probably just start flipping kind of through the pages and saying, well, yeah, this is nice, but not really understanding what I was looking for. So kind of provide a guide. Any other thoughts? Is that the classroom observation form? Awesome. So the classroom observation form, kind of again, if you're maybe new to being a coach or actually just walking into a classroom, kind of gives you a guide of what you're looking for, right? Kind of gives you an idea of just of what specific things you need to see or would like to see. Awesome, thank you. Any other on the side? Okay, all right. Well, thank you guys so much. I'm going to be handing it off to Vanessa, who's going to share. Let me go all the way ahead. Some additional resources. And here we go. Thank you.
So here we are, whipping around the tail end of our time together. Oh, I know, don't be so sad. We might be looking at an early release. But what I want to do is I want to let you know that, again, just like that initial note-taking guide that we provided for you to refer back to, this is another one that is all about pre-referral. So that first one was all about MTSS. This one is all about pre-referral. So all of the tools that Jessica shared with you today in relation to that pre-referral flowchart are included here in this note-taking guide. So linked within that guide is the CUME file check, the extrinsic factors appendix, the intervention summary appendix as well, and the decision-making flowchart. So all of that is included in that note-taking guide. That note-taking guide also has some reflective questions for you to utilize with your team, with your community of practice, with your professional learning community, and it also has a space for you to document some reflection points and potential actionable next steps. When you click on that link, it's going to force copy the note-taking guide for the pre-referral process. Again, just like with the other one, feel free to download it, edit it, make it your own, take what serves you, and discard what doesn't. If you make it better, again, our plead with you is to please share it back, because we love seeing all of the different changes that you make on these documents to make it operable for you and your role. So because of our commitment to supporting you through the work related to collective expertise, we want to share with you additional resources that can be supportive to your journey in learning more about how to best serve and improve outcomes for students who are English learners and English learners with disabilities. So our goal building, capacity building, connecting, and facilitating multidisciplinary team decisions is rooted in our tiered approach. Level 1 supports, which are universal, accessible to all. Level 2 supports, which are inclusive of all of our Level 1 tools and resources, but also coupled with customized PD and supports for your local community of practices, and then those Level 3 supports for technical assistance related more to data analysis, data visualization, and braiding your DA and SIM process. We know that, as our friends from CSOL say, time is an educator's kryptonite. So if you are limited in time and want to have access to nuggets of learning that are 60 minutes max, know that we have an online institute for educational leaders, which are 60 minutes a pop. It's a video that is self-guided. We've linked accompanying slide deck and resources to it, so that you can view on demand, whether it be for your own individual learning or for engaging with a small team. Know that these resources are available by visiting our website, clicking under training, or simply by clicking on the lead image on our website. That is there, as well as additional entry points. Whatever your role is in your LEA, your COE, if you are involved in a regional multidisciplinary team or a SALPA, you can find multiple entry points for your role and responsibilities. Whether it's frequently asked questions related to serving dually identified students, you can find that there. If you're wondering, exemplars of best practices, our student scenarios are available there for you to use. We've taken what is in the practitioner's guide and made these standalone, downloadable student scenarios that you can use to enhance and build your own professional learning. We've also developed multiple infographics. Every single chapter of the California Practitioner's Guide has a corresponding infographic that works as a visual guide, a visual companion to the content. So should you wish to select particular topics that are aided by visuals and live links, click on the infographics link and it'll take you to a PDF document with live links that will take you to all of the resources and the practitioner's guide itself. Because we serve students and their families who speak multiple languages, we wanted to ensure that the appendices that we've shared with you today are available not just in English, but also in Spanish. We've also had them translated to Arabic and Vietnamese, and we're hoping to get all of the other top 10 languages spoken in homes in California that are other than English to have those available for you as tools as well. So know that every single one of these appendices, including the translated ones, are downloadable, savable, fillable, printable to best meet your needs, whether you're building an electronic file and saving these files locally, or doing, the traditional file in the filing cabinet printout, you can do that as well. These resources are available there for you to use as is, or you can take elements of some of the resources and build your own depending on your needs. Know that these resources are free of charge, available online, not just in our website, but also in the practitioner's guide. The only difference between the ones you find in the practitioner's guide and the ones that you find housed here on our website are that these are standalone files, whereas in the practitioner's guide, they're part of the entire PDF document. We also have additional learning opportunities, which are our archived modules. All of our learning opportunities are free of charge and are open to any participant. If you come across a Project Muse flyer for a learning opportunity, know that we will never charge for our PD. We do have different versions of learning opportunities. We have our 60-minute versions and our full-day versions like today. We have some recorded ones that are the Administrators Only Institute that I shared about earlier, and also the Toolkit Institutes. And those Toolkit Institutes are also short in length, 60 minutes, where we focus on one resource and one resource only. And we walk you through the use of that resource so that you can literally take it in your back pocket, walk out the door, and apply it after that 60-minute session. Because we love growing, we know that there's no better way to grow than by receiving feedback. And we truly believe that feedback is a gift. So we are asking that you gift us your feedback by completing the SurveyMonkey survey. We only get better by ensuring that we're listening to you and what you're letting us know you need, what you'd like more of, what you'd like less of, because that keeps us growing and responsive to the needs of the field. With that, we want to thank you for the collective commitment that you've demonstrated by joining us today, because you've proven to want to share in this responsibility and connecting with parents, families, schools, and district professionals to ensure educational equity for all of our students, and that we are committed to providing the highest quality teaching and learning experiences for all. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you in future sessions. Thank you so much.